Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Tonight we travel to the most destructive event in the history of human civilization, to the war that killed between 70 and 85 million people, that reduced the greatest cities of Europe and Asia to rubble, that produced the Holocaust in Hiroshima and the Gulag, that ended the age of European empire and began the age of American supremacy, and that was itself the direct consequence of the war that preceded it. This is the story of the Second World War, the war that the First World War made possible, the war that remade the world, the war whose consequences we are still living inside. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 1. The world between the wars, how peace became impossible. The world that descended into war for the second time in September 1939 was a world that had spent 21 years attempting to prevent exactly what was happening. A world in which the specific memory of the First World War's catastrophic human cost had produced a generation of politicians, soldiers, and ordinary citizens determined above all else to avoid repeating it, and in which that determination had, through a specific combination of institutional weakness, economic catastrophe, moral cowardice, and the systematic exploitation of democratic goodwill by authoritarian movements, produced the conditions that made a second and even more destructive war not merely possible, but virtually certain. The specific causal chain connecting the two world wars runs through the failures of the Versailles settlement and the institutions it created. The war guilt clause and the reparations had humiliated Germany without destroying its capacity to rearm. The League of Nations had been established without the participation of the United States, whose Senate refused ratification, and had proved unable to enforce its covenant against determined aggression. The Japanese seizure of Manchuria in 1931, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, and the German remilitarization of the Rhineland in 1936 had each demonstrated in succession that the League's collective security mechanism would not function against a great power willing to accept diplomatic censure in exchange for territorial gain. The Great Depression of 1929 to 1933 had delivered the final blow to the institutional framework of the post-war order. The mass unemployment that swept through the industrialized world in those years, reaching 30% in Germany, 25% in the United States, produced the political radicalization that swelled the membership of extremist parties on both left and right, and that in Germany specifically provided the electoral base through which Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose from marginal political movement to governmental power in January 1933. The specific economic conditions of the Depression did not make Hitler's rise inevitable. Specific human choices at specific moments could have produced different outcomes, but they created the environment in which his specific combination of nationalist grievance, anti-Semitic ideology, and charismatic authority could achieve what it could not have achieved in the relative prosperity of the 1920s. The world of 1939 was also a world of new military technologies. The tank, the aircraft, the submarine, whose specific operational potential had been demonstrated in the First World War, and whose subsequent development in the interwar period had produced capabilities that the next war would deploy at a scale, and with an effectiveness that the previous one had only begun to suggest. The specific military lessons of the First World War had been absorbed differently by different armies, and the specific divergence between the German army's aggressive development of armored warfare doctrine and the French army's defensive fixation on the lessons of Verdun would determine the outcome of the war's first major campaign in the West with a speed and decisiveness that stunned the world. Fact 2. Adolf Hitler, the man who made the war asterisk. Adolf Hitler, born April 20, 1889 in Braunau am Inn, Austria, failed artist, wounded veteran of the First World War, convicted putschist, author of Mein Kampf, Chancellor of Germany from January 30, 1933, Führer and Reich Chancellor from August 2, 1934, initiator of the Second World War, architect of the Holocaust. Suicide on April 30, 1945, in a Berlin bunker as the Soviet army fought through the streets above him, was the most destructive single individual in the history of the modern world. A man whose specific combination of ideological obsession, political genius, personal charisma, and moral nihilism produced consequences of such catastrophic scale that the attempt to understand how he came to power, how he maintained it, and what drove the specific decisions that produced the Holocaust and the Second World War remains one of the central tasks of historical scholarship 8 decades after his death. The specific ideology that drove Hitler's political program, the worldview set out with remarkable completeness in Mein Kampf, written during his imprisonment following the failed Munich Putsch of 1923 and published in 1925, combined 3 central elements: an extreme racial nationalism that identified the German people as a superior Aryan race whose historical destiny was domination of Europe; a virulent antisemitism that identified the Jewish people as the primary enemy of the German race and the source of Germany's historical misfortunes, and a geopolitical program of Lebensraum, living space, that called for the conquest of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to provide agricultural land and resources for the expanding German population. These elements were not incidental or tactical. They were the core of a coherent, if monstrous, worldview that Hitler held with complete conviction and pursued with consistent single-mindedness from his entry into politics in 1919 to the moment of his death. The specific mechanism of Hitler's rise to power has been the subject of historical debate for decades. The factors that contributed to it include the specific failures of the Weimar Republic's constitutional structure, the economic catastrophe of the Depression, the political miscalculations of conservative German politicians who believed they could use Hitler and control him, the systematic exploitation of legitimate German grievances about the Versailles Settlement, and the specific appeal of a message of national regeneration to a population that had experienced defeat, humiliation, and economic collapse within a single generation. Hitler did not win a majority of the German electorate in any free election. He was appointed Chancellor by President Hindenburg in January 1933 as a political calculation that proved catastrophically wrong. What he then did with the power he had been given, the Reichstag Fire Decree, the Enabling Act, the Night of the Long Knives, the consolidation of all political and military authority in his own person within 18 months of his appointment, was the product of his own specific genius for political manipulation and his specific ruthlessness about the use of violence. Fact 3. The rise of fascism, Italy and the template. The rise of fascism in Italy under Benito Mussolini, the political movement that provided the original template for the authoritarian nationalism that would subsequently transform European politics in the 1930s, and whose specific innovations in the organization and aesthetics of political power would be adopted, adapted, and vastly exceeded by Hitler's Germany, preceded the Nazi seizure of power by more than a decade. And its specific character and its specific failures illuminate both what fascism was and what it became in Germany's more extreme and more systematically murderous version. Benito Mussolini, former socialist journalist, veteran of the First World War, founder of the Fasci Italiani di Combattimento in 1919, came to power in Italy in October 1922 through the threat of the March on Rome. A mobilization of his black-ship paramilitary forces against the Italian state that the king, Victor Emmanuel III, chose to accommodate rather than resist, appointing Mussolini as prime minister rather than ordering the army to disperse the fascist columns. This specific political cowardice, the decision by conservative forces to accommodate the fascist threat rather than confront it, would be repeated across Europe in the following 2 decades, with increasingly catastrophic consequences. Mussolini's Italy was the first fascist state, a one-party dictatorship that systematically dismantled the institutions of liberal democracy while maintaining their forms, that organized the economy under state direction, that cultivated a specific aesthetic of national regeneration centered on Roman imperial imagery and the Duce's theatrical political persona, and that pursued an aggressive foreign policy designed to recreate a Mediterranean empire worthy of ancient Rome. The specific violence of Mussolini's regime was real, political opponents were murdered, press freedom was eliminated, and the invasion and occupation of Ethiopia in 1935 to 1936 involved the use of poison gas against civilian populations, but it was considerably less systematic and considerably less total than what Hitler's Germany would eventually produce. The specific relationship between Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, formalized in the Rome-Berlin Axis of October 1936 and the Pact of Steel of May 1939, was characterized throughout by Hitler's admiration for the man he had originally modeled himself on, and Mussolini's increasingly uneasy recognition that the student had enormously exceeded the teacher. The alliance that should have served Italian interests ultimately consumed them entirely. Fact 4. The road to war from Rhineland to Poland. The specific sequence of German territorial expansions between 1936 and 1939, the remilitarization of the Rhineland in March 1936, the annexation of Austria in March 1938, the annexation of the Sudetenland in October 1938 following the Munich Agreement, the occupation of the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, and finally the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, was a sequence of escalating aggressions whose specific pattern, each step more audacious than the last, each met by Allied accommodation that encouraged the next, revealed both the specific character of Hitler's political method and the specific failures of the democratic response that allowed it to succeed until the point at which accommodation became impossible. The remilitarization of the Rhineland, the reoccupation by German troops of the demilitarized zone established by the Versailles Treaty, was Hitler's first major test of Allied resolve and his most personally anxious gamble. The German military forces involved were small, approximately 22,000 troops, and Hitler had privately told his generals that if the French responded with military force, Germany would have to withdraw. The French did not respond with military force. Britain counseled restraint. The German troops marched into the Rhineland unopposed, and Hitler's personal authority within Germany was enormously strengthened by the success of a gamble that his own military advisors had counseled against. The Munich Agreement of September 1938, the four-power conference between Germany, Britain, France, and Italy, that transferred the Sudetenland to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise that this was his last territorial demand in Europe, was the defining act of appeasement. A policy that the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain defended as a genuine attempt to address legitimate German grievances and secure a durable peace, and that subsequent history has judged as the most catastrophic diplomatic failure of the 20th century. When Chamberlain returned from Munich waving his piece of paper and speaking of peace for our time, he believed what he said. 6 months later, German troops occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia. 6 months after that, they invaded Poland. The invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, preceded by a staged false flag incident at the German radio station at Gleiwitz that Hitler used as a pretext, was the specific act that triggered the Second World War. Britain and France, which had guaranteed Polish independence in March 1939, declared war on Germany on September 3, 1939. The Second World War had begun. Fact 5. Blitzkrieg, Lightning War. The German military doctrine of Blitzkrieg, the specific combination of fast-moving armored formations, motorized infantry, tactical air support, and the exploitation of breakthroughs deep into the enemy rear that defined German offensive operations in the first years of the Second World War, was the single most consequential military innovation of the conflict. A doctrine that destroyed the French army in 6 weeks, conquered Yugoslavia in 11 days, and came within weeks of destroying the Soviet army in the summer of 1941, demonstrating in operation after operation that the specific combination of speed, concentration, and coordination it embodied could achieve results that the slow, attritional warfare of the First World War had proved unable to produce. The intellectual origins of Blitzkrieg are more complicated than the popular image of a single German innovation suggests. The underlying principles, the use of armor in concentrated masses to achieve breakthrough rather than in dispersed support of infantry, the exploitation of that breakthrough by fast-moving forces that bypassed strong points and struck at command and supply systems deep in the enemy rear, the coordination of ground and air forces in a single integrated operational system, had been developed by British military theorists including J.F.C. Fuller and Basil Liddell Hart in the 1920s. Largely ignored by the conservative British Army and adopted with enthusiasm by a German military establishment that had both the institutional incentive to develop offensive doctrines and the specific organizational talent of figures like Heinz Guderian, who turned theoretical concepts into operational reality. The fall of France in May and June 1940 was Blitzkrieg's defining demonstration. The German attack through the Ardennes forest, the route that French strategic planning had assessed as impassable for armored formations, bypassed the heavily defended Maginot Line and cut off the Allied forces in Belgium from their supply and communication lines with a speed and a decisiveness that produced the specific military catastrophe of Dunkirk. The evacuation of approximately 338,000 British and Allied soldiers from the beaches of northern France, leaving behind their equipment, their transport, and any hope of maintaining a coherent front in Western Europe. The fall of France in 6 weeks, the defeat of the army that had held the Western Front for 4 years in the First World War, now collapsed in less than 2 months, was the single most shocking military event of the war's first phase, and its specific speed and completeness shaped the perceptions of every military and political leader in the world about what the next phase of the conflict would bring. Fact 6. Dunkirk, defeat into legend. The evacuation of Dunkirk, Operation Dynamo, the naval operation conducted between May 26 and June 4, 1940, in which approximately 338,226 British, French, and Belgian soldiers were evacuated from the beaches and harbour of Dunkirk on the northern coast of France as the German army closed in from 3 sides, was simultaneously the most catastrophic military defeat in British history since the American Revolution and the most remarkable improvised rescue operation that any nation has ever conducted. A defeat transformed by its specific circumstances into a story of collective resilience and improvised heroism that became the founding myth of Britain's determination to continue the war alone after France's collapse. The specific military situation that produced Dunkirk was the product of the German breakthrough at Sedan on May 13, 1940, which had cut the Allied forces in Belgium off from their supply lines and driven them progressively toward the coast. By May 24, the German armored forces were within striking distance of Dunkirk, and a halt order from Hitler, whose specific motivations remain the subject of historical debate, with explanations ranging from a desire to allow the Luftwaffe to deliver the decisive blow to a tactical concern about overstretching the armored forces, gave the British Expeditionary Force the time to organize the defensive perimeter that made the evacuation possible. The evacuation itself, conducted under continuous German air attack, in conditions of organizational chaos that the planning had been wholly inadequate to manage, was saved by a combination of the Royal Navy's improvisational capacity, the courage of the soldiers holding the perimeter, and the specific participation of the little ships. The hundreds of civilian vessels, fishing boats, pleasure craft, Thames River ferries, private yachts, whose owners sailed them to Dunkirk to take soldiers directly from the beaches when the harbour facilities proved insufficient. The little ships have become the central image of the Dunkirk legend, the civilian population of Britain coming to the rescue of its army in the nation's darkest hour. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister on May 10, 1940, the same day the German offensive in the West began, addressed the House of Commons after the evacuation with the speech that defined Britain's determination to continue the war. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." The speech's specific power came from its specific honesty. Churchill did not pretend that Dunkirk was a victory. He called it a colossal military disaster. What he offered in its place was something more durable than a false victory, the specific commitment of a people to a cause that they knew would cost them everything. Fact 7. The Battle of Britain, the first defeat of Hitler. The Battle of Britain, the sustained German air campaign against Britain, conducted between July and October 1940, in which the German Air Force attempted first to destroy the Royal Air Force as a fighting force, and then to bomb Britain's cities into submission, and in which the RAF's Fighter Command, under Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, succeeded in preventing the Luftwaffe from achieving air superiority over southern England, thereby making the German invasion of Britain impossible and delivering Hitler his first significant strategic defeat, was one of the most consequential campaigns of the entire war. The specific moment at which the seemingly unstoppable momentum of German victory was checked for the first time, and at which the specific possibility of ultimate Allied victory began to be imaginable. The German strategic objective in the Battle of Britain was to achieve the air superiority that would allow Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of southern England, to proceed without the RAF being able to attack the invasion fleet crossing the Channel. This required the destruction of Fighter Command's aircraft, pilots, and ground infrastructure, its airfields, radar stations, and command and control systems, within a period short enough to allow the invasion to take place before the autumn weather made a channel crossing impossible. The RAF's defensive advantage was the specific infrastructure that Dowding had built. The chain-home radar network that provided early warning of German formations approaching from the continent, the sector station system that coordinated the fighter response, and the specific operational doctrine of controlled interception that allowed Dowding to manage his limited resources with a precision that the German commanders, who had no equivalent system, could not match. The Spitfires and Hurricanes of Fighter Command were not significantly inferior to the German Me-109 fighters. The German fighters, operating at the limit of their range from bases in France, had only approximately 20 minutes of combat time over southern England before they had to turn back, a constraint that the RAF exploited throughout the campaign. The German decision in early September 1940 to shift from attacks on RAF infrastructure to the bombing of London, the Blitz, was the specific operational error that allowed Fighter Command to recover from its near-critical attrition of pilots and aircraft in August. The shift to city bombing was partly a response to a British raid on Berlin, partly a deliberate attempt to terrorize the British civilian population, and almost certainly the decision that prevented the Luftwaffe from achieving its primary objective. The RAF survived. The invasion never came. And Churchill, in the speech whose specific phrase has defined the campaign ever since, acknowledged what the young men of Fighter Command had given. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Fact 8. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military operation in history. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, launched on June 22, 1941, involving approximately 3 million German and Axis troops, attacking across a front of approximately 2,900 kilometers from the Baltic to the Black Sea. In the largest military operation in the history of warfare, was the defining strategic decision of the entire Second World War. The choice that determined the war's outcome, that transformed it from a European conflict into a genuinely global one, that produced the Eastern Front's catastrophic human cost of approximately 30 million Soviet dead, and that ultimately destroyed the German army's capacity to win a war it had come within weeks of deciding in its opening months. The specific strategic logic behind Barbarossa, Hitler's decision to attack the Soviet Union while Britain remained undefeated, violating the most fundamental principle of avoiding a two-front war that had shaped German military planning since the age of Bismarck, reflected several intersecting calculations. The ideological imperative to destroy Judeo-Bolshevism and acquire Lebensraum in the East was central to Hitler's worldview from the beginning. The specific strategic calculation that a rapid defeat of the Soviet Union would remove Britain's last potential continental ally and force a negotiated settlement was the military rationale. And the specific assessment, shared by Hitler, his generals, and most Western military observers, that the Red Army had been so severely weakened by Stalin's purge of its officer corps in 1937 to 1938 that it would collapse under the weight of a well-directed German assault in a matter of weeks, provided the operational confidence. The opening months of Barbarossa appeared to validate the most optimistic German predictions. In the first 4 months, the German army captured approximately 3 million Soviet prisoners, destroyed thousands of tanks and aircraft, and advanced hundreds of kilometers into Soviet territory, reaching the outskirts of Moscow in December 1941. The specific military achievements of the Wehrmacht in this period were extraordinary by any historical standard. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. Stalin did not flee. The Red Army, though devastated, continued to find replacements from the enormous population reserves of the USSR. And the German army, which had planned for a campaign of 12 weeks, found itself fighting its second winter in the field without the equipment, the supplies, or the strategic reserves that a longer war required. The specific moment at which Barbarossa's failure became apparent was December 5–6, 1941, when a Soviet counteroffensive outside Moscow drove the exhausted German forces back from the capital they had expected to capture in October. The war in the East, which the German General Staff had planned to finish in 12 weeks, would last almost 4 years. Fact 9. The Holocaust, the war within the war. The Holocaust, the systematic, state-sponsored persecution and murder of approximately 6 million Jews by the Nazi German regime and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945, together with the murder of millions of others including Soviet civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, Polish civilians, Romani people, people with disabilities, homosexuals, and political opponents, was the most comprehensive and most deliberately organized genocide in the history of human civilization. Not an unintended consequence of war, not the product of wartime chaos, but a deliberate policy decision made at the highest levels of the Nazi German state and implemented with systematic efficiency by an industrial bureaucracy whose specific organizational achievements in the service of mass murder represent one of the most disturbing demonstrations of what modern administrative capability can produce when directed by an ideology of murderous racial hatred. The Holocaust did not begin with the death camps. It began in 1933 with the systematic legal exclusion of Jews from German public and economic life. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935, which stripped Jews of German citizenship and prohibited marriage between Jews and non-Jews, were the legal foundation of a persecution that progressively deprived German Jews of their livelihoods, their property, their freedom of movement, and their physical safety. Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, November 9–10, 1938, the nationwide pogrom in which Jewish businesses were destroyed, synagogues burned, and approximately 30,000 Jewish men arrested and sent to concentration camps, was the first major episode of organized mass violence against the Jewish community of Germany and Austria. The specific decision to move from persecution to systematic murder, what historians call the decision for the final solution, appears to have been made, or to have crystallized, in the second half of 1941, in the context of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units that followed the advancing German armies into the Soviet Union began systematic mass shootings of Jewish communities in the occupied Soviet territories in the summer of 1941, killing approximately 1.5 million Jews in mass executions at sites like Babi Yar, where 33,771 Jews were shot in 2 days in September 1941. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942, at which senior Nazi officials coordinated the administrative machinery of the final solution to the Jewish question, formalized and systematized a process of murder that was already underway. The death camps Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek were built specifically to kill human beings at industrial scale, using poison gas to murder thousands of people per day in facilities designed with the specific organizational logic of efficient industrial production. Approximately 3 million Jews were murdered in the death camps alone. The Holocaust was not an aberration from modernity. It was modernity's most terrible product. Fact 10. The Second World War at 10. The shape of catastrophe. 10 facts into the story of the Second World War, and the full dimensions of the catastrophe are already visible in their most essential form. A world that had spent 20 years trying to prevent war produced the most destructive war in human history. A democracy's legitimate desire to avoid repeating the First World War's catastrophic human cost produced the specific policy of appeasement that allowed Hitler to remilitarize, rearm, and expand until the only remaining response was a war that killed 85 million people. The most modern and most administratively sophisticated state in Europe organized the most comprehensive genocide in human history using the specific tools of industrial bureaucracy. These are not comfortable facts. They are facts that resist the comforting narratives through which catastrophes are typically processed. The narrative of inevitable evil defeated by inevitable good, the narrative of exceptional monsters whose crimes tell us nothing about ordinary human nature or ordinary institutional capacity. The Holocaust was not produced by monsters. It was produced by ordinary human beings operating within institutional systems that directed their capacity for bureaucratic efficiency toward the purpose of murder. The appeasement of Hitler was not produced by cowards. It was produced by democratic politicians genuinely attempting to prevent a repetition of the war that had killed 17 million people 20 years earlier. Fact 11. Pearl Harbor, the day that woke America *. The Japanese attack on the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, launched at 7:48 in the morning of December 7, 1941, by 353 Japanese aircraft in 2 waves from 6 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, killing 2,403 Americans, wounding 1,178 more, sinking or damaging 18 warships including 8 battleships, and destroying 188 aircraft, was the single most consequential act of the Pacific War and one of the most consequential single military operations in the history of modern conflict. The event that brought the United States into the Second World War, transforming a conflict that had been primarily European and secondarily Asian into a truly global war whose outcome would be determined by the specific weight of American industrial and military power. The strategic context of the attack was Japan's imperial expansion in Asia and the Pacific, which had been underway since the invasion of Manchuria in 1931, and which had accelerated dramatically with the full-scale war against China begun in 1937. American diplomatic and economic pressure on Japan, above all the oil embargo imposed in July 1941 following Japan's occupation of French Indochina, had confronted the Japanese government with a choice between abandoning its imperial program or going to war against the United States to secure the oil and raw material resources of Southeast Asia that the embargo was cutting off. The decision for war was made, and the attack on Pearl Harbor was designed to destroy the American Pacific Fleet's battleship force before the American response could be organized. The attack achieved its immediate tactical objectives with remarkable effectiveness. The battleship force of the Pacific Fleet was destroyed or severely damaged, and American naval power in the Pacific was significantly reduced. But the attack failed in its most important strategic objective. The 3 American aircraft carriers that were the Pacific Fleet's most valuable assets were all at sea when the attack occurred and escaped undamaged, and the attack's failure to destroy the Pearl Harbor fuel depot and repair facilities meant that the naval base retained its operational utility. The carriers would become the decisive instruments of the Pacific War. The battleships that were sunk at Pearl Harbor would prove to be the less important part of the naval equation. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed Congress on December 8, 1941, calling December 7 a date which will live in infamy, and requesting a declaration of war against Japan. Germany and Italy declared war on the United States 3 days later, a decision by Hitler whose specific strategic logic has puzzled historians ever since there was no treaty obligation requiring it, and since it confirmed precisely the two-front war that had destroyed Germany in 1918. Hitler appears to have calculated that the United States would be too occupied with Japan to focus on Europe for years. It was among the most consequential miscalculations of his career. Fact 12. Winston Churchill, the voice of resistance **. Winston Spencer Churchill, born November 30, 1874 at Blenheim Palace, Oxfordshire, the son of Lord Randolph Churchill and the American socialite Jenny Jerome. Soldier, war correspondent, politician, historian, painter, novelist, Nobel Prize-winning author, and the man who more than any other single individual sustained the Allied cause in the war's darkest hours, was one of the most extraordinary human beings of the 20th century. A figure of such contradictions, such capacities, and such specific historical importance that his biography reads simultaneously as a cautionary tale about the limits of human genius, and as the most compelling argument for the proposition that individual human beings, at specific historical moments, can make the difference between civilization and its opposite. Churchill's path to the prime ministership on May 10, 1940, the day the German offensive in the West began, was one of the most improbable political journeys in British history. He had spent the 1930s in the political wilderness, warning about the Nazi threat in a series of speeches that his conservative colleagues regarded as alarmist, and whose specific accuracy he could not have known was being confirmed by the German rearmament his government's intelligence services were failing to monitor adequately. He had been wrong about numerous major issues in his long career: the Gallipoli disaster, the return to the gold standard, India, the abdication crisis, in ways that made the political establishment's distrust of his judgment seem reasonable by the conventional standards of political evaluation. And then the war came, and it turned out that his specific judgment about the Nazi threat had been the only judgment that mattered. The speeches Churchill delivered in the summer of 1940, "We Shall Fight on the Beaches," the tribute to fighter command, and above all their finest hour, in which he told the British people that the whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us, and asked them to conduct themselves so that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour, were not merely rhetoric. They were an act of political will, the specific decision of a leader to tell his people the truth about the danger they faced, and to ask them to be equal to it, in the conviction that the truth honestly stated was more sustaining than false comfort. Churchill was not a simple figure, and his legacy is not uncomplicated. His views on empire and race reflected the specific prejudices of his class and era in ways that caused genuine suffering. His strategic judgments were sometimes catastrophically wrong. But in the specific moment of 1940 to 1941, when Britain stood alone against Hitler, and the specific question of whether Britain would continue to fight or seek an accommodation was genuinely open, Churchill's particular combination of historical imagination, physical courage, and rhetorical genius was precisely what the situation required. He refused to consider peace terms. He made that refusal magnificent. Fact 13. The North African Campaign, Desert War. The North African Campaign, the series of military operations conducted across the deserts of Libya and Egypt between June 1940 and May 1943, involving the forces of Britain, its Commonwealth partners, Germany, and Italy in a war of extraordinary mobility across a terrain that favored the aggressive use of armored formations in ways that the European theaters did not, was the campaign in which the British Army relearned the art of mobile warfare that the First World War's trenches had made it forget, in which the specific skills of German armored command under Erwin Rommel were most brilliantly displayed, and in which the Allied victory at El Alamein in October and November 1942 provided the first clear British land victory of the entire war and the specific turning point that Churchill recognized as the end of the beginning. The campaign began with the Italian invasion of Egypt from Libya in September 1940, an advance that was rapidly reversed by the British counterattack of Operation Compass in December 1940, which destroyed the Italian 10th Army and advanced approximately 800 kilometers into Libya, capturing approximately 130,000 prisoners in 2 months of fighting. The arrival of German forces under Erwin Rommel in February 1941, the Afrika Korps, sent to prevent the complete collapse of the Italian position in Libya, transformed the campaign's character entirely. Rommel, who had commanded a panzer division in the French campaign, and whose specific gift for rapid, intuitive armored command was arguably the greatest possessed by any German general of the war, launched an immediate offensive that drove the British back to the Egyptian frontier within weeks. The specific character of the North African campaign, the fluid back and forth across the desert, the supply line vulnerabilities that constrained both sides equally, the specific drama of armored battles in open terrain, produced the most operationally dynamic fighting of the entire Western Allied experience of the war. Rommel's specific tactical brilliance and his personal courage under fire earned him the genuine respect of his opponents, a respect that Churchill himself expressed in the House of Commons to subsequent political embarrassment and gave him the popular title of the Desert Fox. The Battle of El Alamein, the decisive engagement in which the British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery defeated the Axis forces in October and November 1942, was not a blitzkrieg-style breakthrough, but a grinding attritional battle of the kind that Montgomery's methodical doctrine specifically sought. A battle of material superiority in which the Allies' advantage in men, tanks, and supplies was brought to bear in a sustained assault that the Axis forces, at the end of an overextended supply line, could not withstand. Before Alamein we never had a victory, Churchill told the House of Commons. After Alamein we never had a defeat. Fact 14. Stalingrad, the turning of the war. The Battle of Stalingrad, the German offensive to capture the city on the Volga River that bore Stalin's name, launched in August 1942, and the Soviet counteroffensive that encircled and ultimately destroyed the German Sixth Army between November 1942 and February 1943, was the most consequential single battle of the entire Second World War. The specific turning point at which the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front shifted irrevocably from Germany to the Soviet Union, the first major German defeat, whose scale and completeness made the eventual Allied victory not merely possible but probable, and the battle whose specific human cost, approximately 2 million total casualties on all sides, makes it the deadliest single battle in the history of warfare. The German advance into southern Russia in the summer of 1942, Operation Blue, had the twin objectives of capturing Stalingrad to cut the Soviet supply line along the Volga and seizing the Caucasus oil fields, whose fuel the Soviet war economy desperately needed. The advance initially made rapid progress, and by late August German forces had reached the outskirts of Stalingrad. What followed was one of the most brutal episodes of urban warfare in military history. A street-by-street, building-by-building battle of extraordinary intensity in which the Soviets, under the inspired tactical direction of General Vasily Chuikov, held the city's western bank of the Volga against repeated German assaults that reduced entire city blocks to rubble and killed thousands of men per day for weeks on end. The specific character of the Stalingrad street fighting, the collapse of the operational distances, at which German combined arms doctrine was most effective to the range of a grenade or a bayonet, the transformation of every building into a fortress and every ruin into a new defensive position, negated the German army's specific operational advantages and imposed a form of combat that tested individual endurance, small unit cohesion, and the specific moral quality of soldiers who continued to fight in conditions that no rational calculation could have identified as survivable. On November 19, 1942, the Soviet Operation Uranus, a massive counteroffensive that attacked the overextended flanks of the German position around Stalingrad, held by the weaker Romanian and Hungarian armies, encircled the entire German Sixth Army of approximately 330,000 men. Hitler forbade a breakout. The relief attempt failed. On February 2, 1943, the remnants of the Sixth Army, approximately 91,000 survivors, including 24 generals and Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, surrendered. Of the 91,000 who surrendered, approximately 5,000 would survive the Soviet prison camps to return to Germany. Fact 15. The Pacific War, island by island. The Pacific War, the series of military campaigns fought between the United States, its allied partners, and the Japanese Empire across the vast oceanic distances of the Pacific from December 1941 to August 1945, involving naval battles of unprecedented scale, amphibious landings on hundreds of islands, and ultimately the strategic bombing campaign and the atomic bombs that ended the conflict, was a war of a fundamentally different character from the European theatre, a war in which geography, naval power, and logistics were as decisive as the quality of the fighting forces, and in which the specific experiences of both soldiers and civilians revealed dimensions of human behavior under extreme conditions that the European theatre, for all its horrors, did not fully replicate. The Japanese Empire's initial offensive in December 1941 and the first months of 1942 was one of the most rapid and most geographically extensive conquests in military history. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had captured the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Burma, and a large arc of Pacific islands extending from Wake Island in the northeast to the Gilbert Islands in the southeast. an area of approximately 8.5 million square kilometers acquired at a human cost that was, by the standards of the subsequent Pacific War, relatively modest. The fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, the British naval base that was supposed to anchor Allied power in Southeast Asia, surrendered with approximately 85,000 troops to a Japanese force of approximately 36,000, was the single most humiliating British military defeat of the entire war. The turning point of the Pacific War came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, 4 days of naval combat in which the United States Navy, using intelligence derived from the breaking of the Japanese Naval Code, ambushed and sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the core of the fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor, at the cost of 1 American carrier. The loss of 4 carriers and their experienced air groups was a blow from which the Japanese naval aviation never fully recovered, and Midway established the strategic dominance of the aircraft carrier over the battleship as the decisive naval instrument of the Pacific War. The subsequent American strategy of island hopping, the selective capture of strategically important islands while bypassing and isolating stronger Japanese positions, compressed the enormous geographical distances of the Pacific into a series of specific, brutal engagements at places whose names, Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, became the specific geography of the American War. Each island a self-contained world of extreme violence, extreme heat, and the specific psychological conditions of combat against an enemy whose specific military culture made surrender almost impossible to negotiate, and whose specific determination to fight to the last defender made every island a battle of annihilation. Fact 16. The home front, total war at home. The home fronts of the major belligerent nations in the Second World War, the civilian populations whose specific contribution to the war effort, through their labor in the factories, their acceptance of rationing and restriction, their management of families in the absence of fathers and brothers and sons, and their specific psychological endurance of bombing, bereavement, and the prolonged anxiety of a war whose outcome was genuinely uncertain for its first 3 years, were not merely the backdrop to the war's military operations, but an integral and essential component of the war's conduct. The specific human and industrial foundation on which the military machine rested, and whose capacity to sustain that machine under the specific pressures of total war, was itself one of the primary determinants of the war's outcome. The United States' conversion to a war economy after Pearl Harbor was the most consequential single industrial transformation in the history of the 20th century. American industrial production, already the largest in the world, was redirected toward military production with a speed and a completeness that exceeded even the most optimistic pre-war projections. By 1944, the United States was producing more military aircraft, more warships, more tanks, more artillery, and more ammunition than all the other belligerent nations combined. The specific role of American industrial output in supplying not only the American armed forces, but also the Soviet and British war efforts through the Lend-Lease program, approximately $50 billion in supplies sent to the Allies, was a material contribution to Allied victory whose specific importance is difficult to overstate. The role of women in the American war economy, symbolized by the iconic figure of Rosie the Riveter, the poster image of a woman flexing her arm in a factory worker's pose, transformed the relationship between gender and economic participation in ways that the post-war return to domestic life temporarily obscured but could not ultimately reverse. Approximately 6 million women entered the American workforce for the first time during the war, taking jobs in aircraft factories, shipyards, munitions plants, and every other sector of the war economy. Their specific contribution to the production of the ships and planes and weapons that won the war was as essential as the contribution of the soldiers who used them. The British home front experience, shaped by the Blitz, by rationing, by the evacuation of children from cities to the countryside, and by the specific social mixing that the disruptions of war produced in a society still deeply marked by class distinctions, produced a specific collective solidarity and a specific expectation of social transformation that would find political expression in the labor landslide of 1945 and the welfare state that followed. Fact 17. The Blitz, when the bombs fell on cities. The Blitz, the sustained German bombing campaign against British cities, conducted primarily between September 1940 and May 1941, in which the Luftwaffe attacked London on 76 consecutive nights and struck major cities including Coventry, Liverpool, Birmingham, Bristol, Southampton, and Plymouth, in a campaign that killed approximately 43,000 British civilians and destroyed or damaged more than 1 million homes. Was the first sustained strategic bombing campaign against a major civilian population in history, and its specific effects on British civilian morale, British social life, and the specific character of the British war experience would shape the nation's self-understanding for generations. The German bombing of London began on September 7, 1940, the same day that the Luftwaffe's strategic shift from attacking RAF infrastructure to attacking the capital gave Fighter Command the recovery time it needed to survive the Battle of Britain. The specific experience of the Blitz, the nightly air raid sirens, the descent into the Anderson shelters or the underground stations that served as public shelters, the drone of German bombers overhead, the crump of falling bombs and the specific visual drama of the burning city became the defining collective experience of the British civilian war, the specific test that produced the specific myth of the Blitz spirit. The stoic, good-humoured, collectively resilient response of ordinary British people to an attempt to break their will through terror. The Blitz spirit is real. The photographic and documentary record of London during the bombing contains genuine evidence of remarkable ordinary courage and collective solidarity. It is also, in part, a myth constructed by wartime propaganda whose specific function was to sustain civilian morale and to project to the watching world, above all to the watching United States, an image of British determination that would influence American public and political opinion. The full picture of the Blitz includes looting, panic, class division in access to shelter, and a government more concerned with managing information about civilian morale than the myth of universal stoicism allows. The bombing of Coventry on the night of November 14 to 15, 1940, in which the medieval city centre, including its famous cathedral, was destroyed in a single night, gave the English language a new verb, to coventrate, meaning to destroy a city by aerial bombardment. The ruined shell of Coventry Cathedral, preserved as a memorial alongside the new cathedral built beside it after the war, remains one of the most powerful symbols of the war's civilian cost in the British landscape. Fact 18. The Eastern Front, the War of Annihilation. The Eastern Front of the Second World War, the vast theatre of military operations between Germany and its allies on one side and the Soviet Union on the other, stretching from the Arctic Circle to the Black Sea across a front that at its maximum extent covered approximately 2,900 kilometers, fought with a ferocity and a deliberate brutality that distinguished it from every other theatre of the war, was the defining campaign of the entire conflict. The theatre in which the war was ultimately won and lost, in which approximately 30 million Soviet citizens died, in which the specific ideological character of the Nazi war, the war of racial annihilation against the Slavic peoples and the Jews of Eastern Europe, was most fully and most horrifyingly expressed. The specific character of the German-Soviet war was determined from its beginning by Hitler's ideological framework. The war in the East was not merely a military conflict, but a racial war of extermination, a Vernichtungskrieg, in which the conventional rules of military conduct, the Geneva Convention, and the basic protections of civilized warfare were explicitly suspended. The Commissar Order of June 1941 directed the summary execution of captured Soviet political officers, the starvation of Soviet prisoners of war. Approximately 3.3 million of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany died in German captivity, primarily from deliberate starvation, was a matter of explicit German policy. The Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units that followed the advancing German armies massacred Jewish communities throughout the occupied Soviet territories in a process of murder that was simultaneous with and inseparable from the military operations of the front. The Soviet war effort in response was sustained at a human cost that has no parallel in any other nation's experience of any conflict in modern history. The specific combination of Stalin's brutal wartime leadership, his purges had removed a significant portion of the Soviet officer corps in 1937 to 1938, and his terror system continued to operate throughout the war, the Soviet people's genuine patriotic resistance to an invasion that threatened national extinction, and the specific ability of the Soviet industrial system, relocated east of the Ural Mountains beyond German bombing range, to produce tanks, aircraft, and artillery in quantities that eventually overwhelmed German production capacity, sustained the Soviet war effort through losses that would have broken any other national system. The Eastern Front produced, between 1941 and 1945, approximately 80% of all German military casualties of the entire war. It was where the Wehrmacht was defeated. Everything else, North Africa, Italy, Normandy, the Pacific, was important and consequential. But the war was won on the Eastern Front, at a price that the world has barely begun to adequately acknowledge. Fact 19. Resistance, the war in the shadows. The resistance movements that operated in German-occupied Europe throughout the Second World War, the networks of partisans, saboteurs, intelligence gatherers, escape line organizers, and underground publishers who maintained the specific human refusal to accept occupation as permanent in France, Poland, Yugoslavia, Greece, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Denmark, and every other territory under German control, were one of the war's most morally complex and most humanly significant dimensions. A phenomenon that combined genuine heroism, extraordinary personal courage, and concrete military contribution with the specific ethical dilemmas of a form of warfare in which the cost of failure was measured not only in the deaths of the resistors themselves, but in the reprisal killings of civilian populations whose collective punishment was the German response to partisan activity. The French resistance, the most celebrated and most extensively mythologized of all the occupied nations' resistance movements, occupied a particularly complex place in the politics and memory of the war. General de Gaulle's Free French movement in London provided the political framework and the radio communications through which French resistance activity was organized and sustained, and the BBC's French service broadcasts, with their coded personal messages interspersed with news, became one of the most remarkable communication systems of the entire war. The specific military contribution of the French resistance to the Normandy campaign, the railway sabotage, the intelligence reporting, the direct attacks on German communication lines, was genuinely significant. The specific human cost of resistance was savage. The Gestapo's methods of infiltration, torture, and the systematic exploitation of networks, once a single member was captured, meant that the effective life of a resistance cell, once compromised, was measured in weeks or days. The specific courage required to maintain resistance activity in this environment, knowing that capture meant torture, and that the information extracted under torture would kill your comrades, was of a kind that existed at the absolute limit of human endurance. In Yugoslavia, the resistance took the form of full-scale partisan warfare under Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans, who by 1944 had pinned down approximately 30 German and Axis divisions in a guerrilla campaign of extraordinary ferocity. The partisan war in Yugoslavia was simultaneously a resistance against German occupation and a civil war between the partisans and the royalist Chetniks, whose collaboration with the Axis, in the calculation that Germany would eventually lose and that it was better to preserve forces for the post-war political struggle, made them, in Allied eyes, the less useful partner. Fact 20, the Second World War at 20, the scale of the conflict asterisk. 20 facts into the story of the Second World War, and the full dimensions of the conflict are visible in all their staggering complexity. A world that spent 20 years trying to prevent a second catastrophe produced one twice as large as the first. A single individual's ideological obsession, combined with the specific political conditions of the Weimar Republic's crisis, produced the most comprehensive genocide in human history. The most modern industrial state organized the most efficient killing machine ever constructed. Democracies that had been paralyzed by the memory of the previous war's costs eventually found the will to fight, and when they did, the specific weight of their industrial capacity proved decisive. The 20 facts behind us have traced the war from the world of appeasement to Pearl Harbor, from Blitzkrieg to Stalingrad, from the fall of France to the Battle of Britain, from the Holocaust's origins to the Eastern Front's specific character of racial extermination. We have met Churchill and Hitler, Rommel and Chuikov, the women in the factories and the partisans in the forests. We have seen the world between the wars that made the Second War possible, and begun to understand the specific ways in which the First War's failures produced the Second War's catastrophe. 80 facts remain. They will carry us through D-Day and Hiroshima, through the liberation of the death camps and the final reckoning in Berlin, through the specific stories of the individuals whose lives illuminate the broader history, and through the question of what a war that killed 85 million people ultimately means for the civilization that produced it and the civilization that survived it. This is explored during Sleeping. Fact 21, the Siege of Leningrad, 872 days. The Siege of Leningrad, the German and Finnish encirclement of the Soviet Union's second city, that began in September 1941 and was not broken until January 1944, making it the longest siege of a major city in the history of modern warfare, was one of the most devastating episodes of civilian suffering in the entire Second World War, and a specific expression of Hitler's ideological intention not merely to defeat the Soviet Union militarily, but to eliminate its population as a viable civilization. Approximately 1 million Soviet civilians died during the siege's 872 days, the overwhelming majority from starvation during the catastrophic first winter, when German forces cut every land supply route into the city and the daily bread ration fell to 125 grams for the most vulnerable residents. a single thin slice of bread mixed with sawdust and non-nutritive materials, designed to provide the sensation of eating without adequate calories. People ate wallpaper paste, leather goods, the glue from book bindings, and in documented cases the bodies of those who had already died. The city's only supply route was the Road of Life, a path across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga, operated under continuous German air attack and artillery bombardment that brought food in and evacuated civilians throughout the winter months. It never brought enough to end the starvation, but enough to prevent the city's complete collapse. Hitler had specifically ordered that Leningrad not be accepted in surrender even if offered. Any attempt by civilians to flee through German lines was to be repelled by force. The intention was extermination by engineering, the deliberate destruction of a city's population through the controlled application of famine. The cultural life of the besieged city continued throughout in ways that expressed a specific human refusal to be reduced to mere biological survival. Dmitri Shostakovich began composing his Seventh Symphony in the besieged city before evacuation. It was performed in Leningrad in August 1942 by an orchestra so weakened by hunger that several musicians had to be carried to the concert hall. The performance was broadcast on loudspeakers throughout the city and on Soviet radio as a deliberate act of cultural defiance whose specific emotional impact on the defenders in the trenches, on the civilians in the ruins, cannot be quantified but should not be doubted. When the siege was finally broken in January 1944, the survivors emerged into streets that had absorbed 872 days of bombardment, starvation, and the specific psychological weight of a city that did not know from one week to the next whether it would survive. They had lost 1 million of their neighbors and family members. They had endured what human beings should not have to endure. They had refused to surrender to the force that had publicly stated its intention to destroy them. The Siege of Leningrad remains one of the 20th century's most profound demonstrations of what the human capacity for endurance looks like when it is tested beyond any previously known limit. Fact 22. Enigma, the secret that won the war asterisk. The breaking of the German Enigma cipher, the electromechanical encryption system used by the German armed forces to encode virtually all their military communications, whose solution was first achieved by Polish mathematicians in the 1930s and subsequently developed into a systematic operational intelligence program by the British codebreakers at Bletchley Park in Buckinghamshire, was arguably the most consequential intelligence achievement in the history of warfare. A secret kept so successfully for 3 decades after the war ended that the full extent of its contribution to Allied victory was unknown to the historians who were writing the conflict's standard accounts. The Enigma machine encrypted messages by passing each letter through a series of rotating mechanical rotors that substituted it for a different letter in a pattern that changed with every keystroke, making the cipher theoretically unbreakable without knowing the specific daily settings of the rotors, settings that the German military changed every 24 hours and that the Bletchley codebreakers had to reconstruct each day from scratch. The mathematical breakthrough that made this possible was achieved primarily by the Cambridge mathematician Alan Turing, whose conceptual design of the bomb, an electromechanical device that could search through possible Enigma settings at high speed to identify the correct configuration, provided the intellectual foundation on which the entire operation rested. At its peak, Bletchley Park employed approximately 10,000 people, including mathematicians, chess champions, linguists, crossword enthusiasts, and a supporting staff whose specific combination of unconventional thinking and systematic effort produced a continuous stream of decrypted German operational traffic, codenamed Ultra. The intelligence product that Ultra provided shaped Allied operations across every theater. Rommel's supply convoys were sunk in the Mediterranean because Ultra revealed their routes and schedules. The German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic was broken partly because Ultra provided the positions of submarine patrol lines. The Normandy deception succeeded partly because Ultra confirmed that the German High Command believed it. Churchill described the Bletchley codebreakers as the geese that laid the golden eggs and never cackled. Some historians have estimated that Ultra shortened the war by 2 years. The specific human cost of maintaining the secret was also real. On multiple occasions, Allied commanders chose not to act on Ultra intelligence, or acted in ways designed to suggest alternative explanations, to prevent the Germans from suspecting their cipher was broken. Ships were sunk, convoys attacked, operations allowed to proceed when Ultra intelligence might have prevented them, because the long-term value of the intelligence source outweighed the short-term cost of specific losses. The secret was kept until 1974. Alan Turing, the man most responsible for making it possible, was prosecuted by the British government for homosexuality in 1952 chemically castrated as a condition of avoiding prison, and died of cyanide poisoning in 1954, in circumstances officially ruled suicide. Fact 23. El Alamein, the hinge. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought between October 23 and November 11, 1942, in the Egyptian desert, approximately 106 kilometers west of Alexandria, between General Bernard Montgomery's British Eighth Army, of approximately 195,000 men, and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Panzer Army Africa, of approximately 116,000. Was the first clear British land victory of the entire war, and the specific turning point that Churchill identified as the conflict's strategic hinge. The battle was preceded by Montgomery's methodical preparation, the accumulation of material superiority in tanks, artillery and supplies before the attack was launched, and the careful training of an army that had been repeatedly defeated under previous commanders in ways that had eroded its confidence as much as its equipment. Montgomery was not a brilliant improviser in the manner of Rommel. He was a careful, systematic planner who understood that British forces in 1942 needed to fight battles whose outcome depended on preparation and material advantage rather than on the intuitive operational genius that Rommel possessed in abundance, and British commanders did not. The opening artillery barrage on the night of October 23 involved approximately 900 guns firing simultaneously in one of the heaviest concentrations of firepower in the Desert War. The subsequent battle was not a rapid breakthrough, but a grinding attritional struggle. Montgomery called it crumbling the German defenses, systematically destroying Axis armor and infantry in a process of wearing down that lasted 12 days before the final breakthrough became possible. Rommel, who had returned from sick leave in Germany to command the battle, was fighting with severely reduced fuel and ammunition supplies. The Allied interdiction of Axis supply lines across the Mediterranean, aided by ultra-intelligence, had created critical shortages that limited his ability to maneuver. When the breakthrough came on November 2, the Axis forces retreated westward and did not stop until Tunisia. 3 days after the battle ended, Operation Torch, the Allied landings in northwest Africa, closed the western escape route. Within 6 months, approximately 250,000 German and Italian soldiers had surrendered in Tunisia. Churchill's assessment captured the battle's significance with his characteristic precision and his characteristic awareness of proportion. Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. He added, with the wisdom of someone who had lived through the First World War's false dawns as well, "This is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." He was exactly right on both counts. Fact 24. The Battle of the Atlantic, keeping Britain alive. The Battle of the Atlantic, the sustained campaign between German U-boats and Allied convoy escorts fought across the North Atlantic from the first days of the war in September 1939 to Germany's defeat in May 1945, was the campaign that Churchill later said frightened him more than any other during the entire war, because it was the one whose loss would have meant Britain's physical inability to continue fighting regardless of the outcome of every other campaign. Britain was an island nation that imported approximately 50 million tons of food, raw materials, and military equipment each year. Without those imports, the country could not feed its population, fuel its factories, or equip its armed forces. German U-boats aimed to cut that supply line entirely, and in the war's early years they came horrifyingly close to achieving it. In 1942, U-boats sank approximately 1,664 Allied ships, totaling approximately 7.8 million tons of shipping, a rate of loss that threatened to exceed the Allied capacity for replacement, and that, if sustained, would have made continued British participation in the war logistically impossible. The U-boat crews who achieved these kills were not monsters, but professional naval personnel operating under extreme conditions. The interior of a submerged submarine in the mid-Atlantic in winter, with depth charges exploding around it, was an environment of extraordinary physical and psychological stress, and the casualty rate among U-boat crews, approximately 75% killed by the end of the war, was among the highest of any military service of any nation in the entire conflict. The battle's turning point came in May 1943, when the convergence of multiple Allied advantages, improved convoy escorts, long-range aircraft with radar hunter-killer groups using ultra-intelligence to locate and destroy U-boat wolf packs, produced the loss of 41 U-boats in a single month. Admiral Dönitz, who had built the U-boat service into Germany's most effective strategic weapon, withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic, acknowledging in his diary that the battle had been lost. The supply line to Britain was secured. The accumulation of American forces and equipment in Britain for the eventual cross-channel invasion could proceed. The specific decision to invest in convoy protection rather than offensive operations, resisted by Churchill himself, who preferred striking the U-boats at their bases, was vindicated by the specific mathematics of ships sunk versus ships built, an equation that only turned positive when the defensive investment was finally made at adequate scale. Fact 25. The Italian campaign, the hard underbelly. The Allied invasion of Italy, launched in September 1943 following the conquest of Sicily, and producing a grinding 20-month campaign up the peninsula against German defensive lines, whose specific exploitation of the mountainous Italian terrain made every kilometer of advance extraordinarily costly, was the campaign that most persistently exposed the gap between the strategic optimism of Churchill's soft underbelly of Europe formulation and the specific reality of fighting against a competent German army and country that could not have been better designed for defense if it had been sculpted for that purpose. The Apennine Mountains run like a spine down the length of Italy. The rivers that cross the peninsula at right angles to the Allied line of advance provided the German commander Albert Kesselring with a continuous series of natural defensive positions that could be held by relatively small forces against larger attacking armies. Each defensive line had to be outflanked or stormed at great cost. Each breakthrough led only to the next defensive position. The Allies landed at Anzio in January 1944 in an attempt to bypass the Gustav Line. The beachhead was contained for 4 months before a breakout became possible. The Battle of Monte Cassino, 4 separate Allied assaults against the medieval monastery that overlooked the main road north, cost approximately 0 Allied casualties and produced the controversial decision to bomb the monastery itself, which the Germans had not been using as a military position, but promptly occupied as rubble after the bombing made it a more defensible ruin. Rome was liberated on June 4, 1944, a genuine achievement celebrated for approximately 48 hours before D-Day overshadowed it entirely. The Italian campaign ground on through the Gothic Line in autumn 1944 and the final Po Valley offensive in April 1945. Its total cost was approximately 313,000 Allied casualties. Its strategic contribution, holding approximately 20 German divisions in Italy that were unavailable for the defense of France and the Eastern Front, was real but came at a price that the specific difficulty of the terrain and the specific quality of German defensive generalship made far higher than the planners who conceived the operation had anticipated. Fact 26. D-Day, the longest day. The Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious military operation in history, involving approximately 156,000 American, British, Canadian and Allied soldiers crossing the English Channel in approximately 5,000 ships under the cover of approximately 11,000 aircraft, with a specific military operation whose success made the liberation of Western Europe possible and whose planning deception and execution represent the most complex combined military operation ever attempted. The landings at 5 beaches, Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno and Sword, were preceded by the dropping of approximately 24,000 airborne troops behind the German lines and by the most successful strategic deception operation in military history, Operation Bodyguard, which convinced the German High Command through a combination of false radio traffic, double agents, and fake army formations that the main Allied landing would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. This deception kept Germany's armoured reserves, including the panzer divisions that could have driven the landings back into the sea, away from the beaches on the critical first day, waiting for an attack that never came. The bloodiest landing was Omaha Beach, where the 1st and 29th American Infantry Divisions faced strongly positioned German defenders on bluffs overlooking a beach that provided no cover, suffering approximately 2,000 casualties in the first hours. The American soldiers who crossed Omaha Beach on June 6 did so without the tactical advantages that the other beaches enjoyed. Their specialized armor had been launched too far offshore and most had sunk, leaving the infantry naked against the German defenses. They got across the beach because individual soldiers and small groups kept moving forward under fire in conditions that made forward movement an act of extraordinary will. By nightfall on June 6, all 5 beachheads had been secured at a total cost of approximately 10,000 Allied casualties. Within a month, approximately 1 million Allied soldiers were ashore in Normandy. The liberation of Europe, which had seemed impossible in 1940 and unlikely in 1941, had decisively begun. Fact 27. Operation Market Garden, a bridge too far. Operation Market Garden, the Allied airborne and ground offensive launched on September 17, 1944, conceived by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery as a bold attempt to seize the Rhine crossings through the Netherlands in a single operation, and thereby end the war in Europe before Christmas, was the largest airborne operation in history, the most audacious Allied offensive of the entire campaign in the West, and one of the most consequential Allied failures of the entire war. A plan of genuine strategic vision, whose specific execution was defeated by a combination of German resilience, catastrophically poor intelligence, and the fundamental logistical impossibility of the ground advance keeping pace with the timetable the airborne forces required. 3 Allied airborne divisions were dropped simultaneously along a 60-mile corridor through occupied Netherlands, tasked with capturing a series of bridges over the canals and rivers that blocked the path of the British XXX Corps advancing from the Belgian border. The American 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions captured their objectives at Eindhoven and Nijmegen with great skill and at considerable cost. The British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, tasked with capturing the bridge over the Rhine that would open the road into Germany, landed 7 miles from its objective to avoid flak concentrations, and found itself fighting against 2 SS Panzer divisions resting and refitting in the woods around Arnhem, whose presence Allied intelligence had assessed as negligible. The intelligence failure was catastrophic. The specific information that SS armoured units were in the Arnhem area had been provided by the Dutch resistance and by aerial reconnaissance photographs, and had been discounted or suppressed at planning levels whose specific reasoning has never been satisfactorily explained. Of approximately 10,000 British paratroopers who landed near Arnhem, approximately 1,900 were evacuated after 9 days of fighting, approximately 6,500 were captured, and approximately 1,500 were killed. The Rhine Bridge, the bridge too far, as the operation's own chief of staff had privately called it, remained in German hands. The war would last another 8 months and cost hundreds of thousands of additional lives. Fact 28. Auschwitz, the heart of the Holocaust asterisk. Auschwitz-Birkenau, the complex of concentration and extermination camps established by the SS near the Polish town of Oswiecim, operating from May 1940 to January 1945, and constituting the largest and most lethal of all the Nazi killing facilities, was the physical center of the Holocaust and the place where the specific character of the Nazi genocide, its industrial scale, its bureaucratic organization, its specific transformation of murder into an administrative process, was most fully and most horrifyingly expressed. Approximately 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz, the overwhelming majority of them Jews transporting by railway from across occupied Europe, to be killed immediately upon arrival in gas chambers using Zyklon B, a pesticide whose specific properties the camp's administration had selected after experiments with other killing methods. The operational logic of the camp was organized around the selection process conducted on the arrival ramp. Those deemed capable of forced labor were directed to the left. Those selected for immediate death, typically the elderly, children, pregnant women, and the sick, were directed to the right, toward the changing rooms where they were told to undress for showers, and then into the gas chambers whose specific architecture was designed to prevent panic by maintaining the deception of the shower facilities until the Zyklon B pellets were dropped through the roof vents. The Sonderkommando, prisoners forced to remove the bodies from the gas chambers, extract the gold teeth, sort the victims' clothing and possessions, and operate the crematoria, lived with the knowledge of what they were doing and the knowledge that they would themselves eventually be killed and replaced. Rudolf Höss, the camp's commandant, maintained meticulous administrative records of the killing's efficiency and wrote a memoir after his capture in which he described the operational challenges of mass murder with the same detachment a factory manager might bring to a production bottleneck. He was hanged at Auschwitz in 1947. Fact 29. Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the cost of the final approach asterisk. The battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa in the first half of 1945, the final American stepping stones toward the Japanese home islands, captured against Japanese defenders, who demonstrated an almost absolute willingness to die rather than surrender, provided the American military and political leadership with the specific human evidence that shaped the decision to use atomic bombs against Japan rather than launch the ground invasion whose planning was already underway. Iwo Jima, a volcanic island of approximately 8 square kilometers, whose primary strategic value was as a base for fighter aircraft escorting the B-29 bombers attacking Japan, was defended by approximately 22,000 Japanese soldiers who had spent months constructing an elaborate network of underground tunnels, bunkers, and firing positions whose specific design was intended to make every meter of American advance cost maximum casualties. The battle lasted 36 days and cost approximately 6,800 American dead and nearly 26,000 wounded. Approximately 18,000 of the 22,000 Japanese defenders were killed. Approximately 216 were captured. The photograph of American Marines raising the flag on Mount Suribachi, taken by Associated Press photographer Joe Rosenthal on February 23, 1945, became one of the most recognized images of the entire war and won the Pulitzer Prize. But the flag raising came on day 4 of a battle that lasted 32 more days after it was taken. Okinawa, fought from April to June 1945, cost approximately 12,000 American dead and 36,000 wounded, along with approximately 110,000 Japanese military dead and an estimated 100,000 to 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed in the crossfire of a battle fought across a densely populated island. American military planners, calculating the potential cost of Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, scheduled for November 1945, used Iwo Jima and Okinawa as their primary data points. Their casualty estimates ranged from 250,000 to over 1 million American dead. These numbers were the specific human context within which the decision to use the atomic bomb was made. Fact 30, the Second World War at 30, the hinge year. 30 facts into the story of the Second World War, and 3 of the conflict's defining turning points are now fully visible in their historical significance. The winter of 1942 to 1943 was the war's hinge. Stalingrad ended the German offensive capacity in the east in the most dramatic and most costly way imaginable. Alamein ended the Axis threat to the Middle East and provided the first clear British land victory of the war. And the breaking of the U-boat campaign in the Atlantic secured Britain's ability to continue fighting and to accumulate the forces that would eventually cross to France. Each of these turning points was preceded by genuine uncertainty about which way the war would go. As late as November 1942, the outcome was still genuinely in doubt, and the specific combination of Soviet military resilience, Allied industrial capacity, and the intelligence advantage of Ultra that tipped the balance was neither inevitable nor foreordained at any moment. D-Day and the liberation of Western Europe, the fall of Berlin, the atomic bombs and Japan's surrender, all of these still lay ahead. The Holocaust was still being carried out at full operational capacity in the death camps of occupied Poland. The Pacific War was still producing casualties at a rate that would continue for 3 more years. The specific human cost of the war was still accumulating, but the direction of the conflict had shifted, and every leader on every side knew it. 70 facts remain. They will carry us through the war's final chapters, through liberation and destruction, through the founding of the post-war order and the beginning of the Cold War, and through the specific question of what a civilization determines to build when it has seen what it is capable of destroying. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 31, the Big Three, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. The alliance between Winston Churchill, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin, the 3 leaders whose nations provided the primary military weight of the Allied war effort, was the most consequential and most improbable political partnership of the entire conflict. Churchill was a British aristocrat who had spent decades warning about the dangers of both fascism and communism. Roosevelt was an American Democrat committed to anti-colonialism and deeply suspicious of European imperial ambition, a president who had built his political career on domestic reform and had navigated his country through neutrality for more than 2 years while the war consumed Europe. Stalin was a Soviet dictator, personally responsible for the deaths of millions of his own citizens through the purges of 1937 to 1938, forced collectivization, and the organized terror of the Gulag system. A man whose specific criminality toward his own people was well known to both Churchill and Roosevelt, and who was accepted as a necessary partner because the alternative to Soviet participation in the war against Hitler was too strategically catastrophic to contemplate. What united 3 such different men was a single shared enemy and the cold calculation that defeating Hitler required setting aside every other disagreement for the duration. The 3 major summit meetings, Tehran in November 1943, Yalta in February 1945, and Potsdam in July 1945, where Churchill had been replaced mid-conference by the newly elected Clement Attlee, shaped not only the military conduct of the war, but the political architecture of the world that would emerge from it. The specific agreements at Yalta, on the occupation zones of Germany, the borders of Poland, the structure of the United Nations, and Soviet entry into the Pacific War, have been debated, celebrated, and condemned with roughly equal intensity in the 8 decades since they were made. Critics have argued that Roosevelt was naive, ill, or deceived by Stalin's assurances about free elections in Eastern Europe. The more accurate assessment is that military realities of February 1945, with Soviet armies already in physical possession of Poland, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, gave the Western Allies very limited practical leverage to demand conditions the Soviets had no military incentive to accept. The Big Three alliance held long enough to defeat Hitler. It did not survive his death by many months. Fact 32. The Tuskegee Airmen flying against two enemies. The Tuskegee Airmen, the approximately 996 African-American military pilots who trained at the Tuskegee Army Airfield in Alabama and served in the United States Army Air Forces during the Second World War, fought simultaneously against Nazi Germany in the air over Europe and against the racial segregation of the American military on the ground at home, making their wartime service one of the most morally complex and most historically significant military experiences in American history. The prevailing view within the segregated American military establishment at the war's beginning was that black pilots were intellectually and temperamentally unsuited for combat aviation, a view held by senior officers with the specific institutional confidence that racism generates in those who have never had to seriously examine the premise on which their prejudice rests. The Tuskegee experiment was conceived partly as a controlled test of this hypothesis, with many officials expecting failure to confirm their assumptions. Instead, the program produced pilots of exceptional quality who methodically demolished the premise of their own segregation through accumulated operational performance. The 332nd Fighter Group, which flew bomber escort missions deep into Germany and occupied Europe, compiled a record that included the destruction of approximately 260 enemy aircraft and earned more than 150 distinguished flying crosses. Their bomber escort record, the claim that they never lost a bomber under their protection to enemy fighters, has been disputed in its most absolute form by subsequent historical research, but it reflects a genuine operational effectiveness that was recognized by the bomber crews who requested the red tails specifically for their missions. The Tuskegee Airmen's specific contribution to the war forced a public reckoning with the contradiction between fighting for democracy and freedom overseas, while the men doing the fighting were denied those same qualities at home. Their service became one of the primary arguments used by civil rights advocates in the post-war campaign for military desegregation, achieved by President Truman's executive order in July 1948. They flew against two enemies. They defeated both, though the second victory required the additional battles of an entire subsequent generation. Fact 33. Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought from October 23 to 26, 1944, in the waters surrounding the Philippine island of Leyte, involving approximately 370 Allied warships against 216 Japanese warships in a series of engagements spread across an area of ocean larger than France, was the largest naval battle in the history of warfare, and the engagement that effectively ended the Japanese Imperial Navy as a force capable of seriously contesting American control of the Pacific. The Japanese plan, Operation Shogo, was a complex four-pronged attack designed to destroy the American invasion fleet supporting the Leyte landings by using the remaining carrier force as a decoy to lure the American fast carriers away, while the main surface battle fleet drove through to the vulnerable troop transports. The plan came terrifyingly close to success in the engagement known as the Battle off Samar, where Vice Admiral Kurita's battleship force, including the Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, broke through to the lightly defended escort carriers and destroyers of Task Unit Taffy 3. What followed was one of the most remarkable defensive actions in American naval history. The tiny ships of Taffy 3, escort carriers, whose primary function was supporting amphibious operations, destroyers and destroyer escorts never designed for fleet combat, charged the Japanese battleships in a desperate, ferocious defensive action of such unexpected violence that Kurita, believing he faced a much larger force, eventually turned away rather than pressing what should have been an overwhelming advantage. The battle also witnessed the first organized use of kamikaze aircraft, a tactic in which Japanese pilots deliberately crashed explosive-laden planes into American warships. The kamikaze program, formalized after Leyte Gulf, would kill approximately 3,800 Americans and damage or sink hundreds of vessels in the war's remaining months, making it the most tactically effective new Japanese weapon of the war's final phase, and the specific demonstration that Japan was prepared to accept any cost rather than surrender. Fact 34. The Warsaw Uprising, a city destroyed. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1 to October 2, 1944, the armed revolt launched by the Polish Home Army against the German occupation of Warsaw, in which approximately 40,000 Polish fighters held the city against vastly superior German forces for 63 days, was one of the most tragic, most heroic, and most politically charged episodes of the entire Second World War in Europe. A revolt whose timing reflected the Polish government in exile's determination to liberate Warsaw, before Soviet forces arrived and established a non-communist authority as the city's legitimate liberators, and whose catastrophic failure reflected both the military imbalance between the Home Army's limited weapons and the German forces, and the specific decision by Stalin to halt the Soviet advance on Warsaw's eastern bank and deny the uprising the support that might have saved it. Stalin refused to allow British and American aircraft to use Soviet airfields for supply missions to the uprising, a refusal that condemned the Polish fighters to fight on with weapons running critically short, while Soviet forces waited within hearing of the battle. Whether his inaction reflected primarily strategic calculation, the political desire to eliminate the non-communist Polish resistance leadership, or some combination of both remains debated by historians who have had access to Soviet archives. What is not debated is the human cost. Approximately 200,000 Polish civilians and 16,000 Polish fighters were killed in 63 days of combat and reprisal. Heinrich Himmler personally ordered the systematic destruction of Warsaw after the uprising's suppression, and approximately 85% of the city was deliberately demolished building by building as a specific act of civilizational annihilation. When Soviet forces finally entered the city in January 1945, they found a landscape of rubble in which almost nothing recognizable remained standing. The Polish nation's capital had been essentially erased from the earth. Fact 35. Women spies, the agents behind enemy lines. The women who served as agents of Britain's Special Operations Executive in occupied France, parachuted or delivered by small aircraft into enemy territory, tasked with organizing resistance networks, transmitting intelligence to London, conducting sabotage, and sustaining the morale and operational capability of occupied populations, were among the most courageous individuals produced by the entire war. Human beings who operated in an environment where capture meant torture and almost certain death, where the expected operational lifespan of a wireless operator in occupied Paris was measured in weeks rather than months, and where the only available response to the perpetual danger of betrayal, surveillance, and arrest was the absolute and sustained maintenance of a false identity under conditions of psychological pressure that few people have ever been required to endure. Violette Charbot, born of a British father and a French mother, whose husband had been killed at Alamein, was captured after a firefight with German troops in the Limousin, interrogated and tortured by the Gestapo at the Avenue Foch in Paris, and executed at Ravensbrück concentration camp in February 1945 at the age of 23. Noura Nayat Khan, the daughter of an Indian Sufi musician and an American mother, a pacifist by conviction who chose to fight because she believed the specific evil of Nazism required active personal resistance, became the first female wireless operator infiltrated into occupied France, continued transmitting after every other agent in her network had been captured or killed, was eventually betrayed, arrested, and executed at Dachau in September 1944. Both were awarded the George Cross posthumously. Their specific courage belongs to the same category as the most celebrated acts of military heroism in the war's entire record, and was for decades recognized less than those acts, for reasons that speak to the specific biases of the institutions that employed them and the culture that commemorated the war. Fact 36. The liberation of Paris, a city returns. The liberation of Paris on August 25, 1944, achieved by the French 2nd Armored Division rather than American forces, following a specific political decision by Supreme Commander Eisenhower, responding to de Gaulle's insistence that French soldiers must be seen to liberate the French capital, was one of the most emotionally charged events of the entire war in the Western theater. A moment of collective joy whose specific quality, after 4 years of German occupation, expressed a depth of relief, pride, and reconstituted national identity that no purely military event could have produced. General de Gaulle's walk down the Champs-Élysées on August 26, through crowds of hundreds of thousands of celebrating Parisians, under sniper fire whose origin remained disputed but whose danger was real, was simultaneously a genuine moment of liberation and a carefully managed political performance in which de Gaulle was constructing in real time the narrative of French resistance that would define French national memory of the war for decades. A narrative in which the Vichy regime's collaboration was treated as an aberration imposed on a fundamentally resistant people, rather than as a reflection of the specific divisions and specific calculations that had led the majority of French society to accommodate itself to occupation. The complications of that narrative were real and specific. The Vichy government's administrative role in the deportation of approximately 77,000 French Jews to the death camps, the murders committed by the French milice against French resistors and civilians, the economic collaboration that kept French industry running in service of the German war machine, These facts were acknowledged only slowly and painfully in French national life over the following decades. The joy of August 25, 1944, was real. It was earned at great cost by real people. It does not require a simplified narrative to be honored honestly. Fact 37. The V-weapons, Hitler's revenge. The German V-weapons program, the development and operational deployment of the V-1 flying bomb, and the V-2 ballistic missile against Britain and later, against the liberated cities of Antwerp and Brussels, was simultaneously the most technologically advanced weapons system of the entire war, the direct ancestor of every ballistic missile built since, and one of the most morally ambiguous achievements in the history of weapons technology. Produced at a human cost in slave labor that exceeded the casualties the weapons themselves inflicted. The V-1 was a pulse-jet-powered flying bomb carrying an 850-kilogram warhead, launched from ramps along the French and Dutch coasts at a speed of approximately 640 kilometers per hour, in a straight and level flight that made it interceptable by fast fighters and shootable by anti-aircraft guns. Pilots discovered they could tip the bombs off course by flying alongside and physically lifting the V-1's wing with their own aircraft's wingtip. Avoiding the risk of detonating the warhead, approximately 2,500 reached London, killing approximately 6,184 people. The V-2 was a fundamentally different weapon, the world's first operational ballistic missile, a liquid-fueled rocket that reached the edge of space at the apex of its trajectory, arrived at its target at approximately 5,000 kilometers per hour with no warning whatsoever, and could not be intercepted by any defensive system available in 1944. Approximately 1,400 fell on London, killing approximately 2,754 people. The program's scientific director, Wernher von Braun, was competed for by both the United States and the Soviet Union in the war's final days. The Americans obtained him, and he went on to lead the Saturn V rocket program that carried American astronauts to the moon. The V-weapons were produced using approximately 60,000 concentration camp prisoners as forced labor in underground factories, of whom approximately 20,000 died in the production process, more people than both weapons combined killed in operation. Fact 38. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last gamble. The Battle of the Bulge, the German Ardennes offensive launched on December 16, 1944, in which three German armies totaling approximately 410,000 men and 1,400 tanks attacked through the fog and snow of the densely forested Ardennes, creating a 60-mile deep bulge in the Allied line and surrounding the American garrison of Bastogne. Was Germany's final major offensive in the West and the largest single battle ever fought by the United States Army, costing approximately 76,000 American casualties before the German advance was halted and reversed. Hitler's strategic concept was audacious, a thrust to the Meuse River and eventually to the port of Antwerp that would split the Allied armies, cut off the British forces in the north from their American partners in the south, and recreate the conditions of May 1940, when a similar offensive through the Ardennes had destroyed the Allied position in France in 6 weeks. The concept had worked brilliantly in 1940 against an unprepared enemy. It's a battle-hardened Allied army with overwhelming air superiority, temporarily grounded by the same winter fog that had allowed the Germans to achieve initial surprise. It could only succeed if fuel could be captured from American supply depots. The weather continued to ground Allied aircraft, and the Allied response was slower than it proved to be. When General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the encircled Bastogne garrison, received a German demand for surrender, his one-word reply, "Nuts," entered American military legend. When the weather cleared on December 23 and Allied air power returned, the German advance stalled against fuel shortages and determined resistance. General Patton's Third Army, in an extraordinary feat of staff planning and logistical execution, wheeled 90 degrees in 48 hours and drove 100 miles to relieve Bastogne on December 26. By mid-January 1945, the Bulge had been eliminated. Germany had expended its last armored reserves in the west, and the road to the Rhine lay open. Fact 39. Yalta, the conference that shaped the post-war world. The Yalta Conference, the summit meeting of Churchill, Roosevelt and Stalin held at the Levadia Palace in Crimea from February 4 to 11, 1945, reached after a journey Roosevelt described as extraordinarily difficult for a man who was visibly and seriously ill, was the meeting at which the broad outlines of the post-war world order were negotiated among the three leaders whose military power would determine that order's specific character. The agreements at Yalta covered the structure of the United Nations and the veto rights of the Security Council's permanent members, the division of Germany into occupation zones, the requirement for free and fair elections in the liberated nations of Eastern Europe, the specific borders of Poland, which were shifted westward at Soviet insistence to compensate for the eastern territories the Soviet Union intended to retain. And the secret protocol agreeing that the Soviet Union would enter the Pacific War within 3 months of Germany's defeat, in exchange for territorial concessions in Asia that included the Kuril Islands and rights in Manchuria. Roosevelt, dead of a cerebral hemorrhage within 2 months of Yalta, was subsequently accused of having been deceived by Stalin or of having been too ill to defend Western interests adequately. The more defensible assessment is that the Soviet Army's physical occupation of Eastern Europe at the moment of the Yalta negotiations made the paper guarantees of free elections essentially unenforceable regardless of the diplomatic skill of the Western negotiators. What the Western Allies conceded at Yalta, they had already lost on the battlefield. Fact 40, the Second World War at 40, the final year approaches. 40 facts into the story of the Second World War, and the war is entering its final, and in some respects its most terrible year. The military outcome is no longer in genuine doubt. Germany is fighting on 2 fronts with its armored reserves exhausted, its cities being destroyed by round-the-clock Allied bombing, its eastern defenses collapsing before a Soviet army that has been fighting its way toward Berlin since Stalingrad. Japan is being methodically compressed toward its home islands by American naval and air power, whose material dominance is now absolute, and whose firebombing campaign is reducing Japanese cities to ash. But the specific horror of the war is not diminishing with its approaching end. In certain respects, it is intensifying. The death camps are still operating at full capacity as the Soviet army approaches from the east. The firebombing of Dresden in February 1945 and the destruction of Tokyo in March 1945 are still ahead. The atomic bombs are still being assembled in Los Alamos. The Battle of Berlin, in which tens of thousands of civilians will die in the fighting, has not yet begun. The specific decisions of the war's final months, who will liberate which cities, what terms Japan will be offered, what the post-war borders will be, will shape the next half-century of international politics. 60 facts remain. They will carry us through liberation and destruction, through the founding of a new international order and the beginning of the Cold War, and through the specific question of what a world that survived its worst catastrophe chose to build in the years that followed. This is explored during Sleeping. **** Fact 41, the liberation of the death camps, what the world saw ***. The liberation of the Nazi concentration and extermination camps by Allied forces in the spring of 1945. Majdanek by Soviet forces in July 1944. Auschwitz on January 27. Bergen-Belsen by British troops on April 15. Dachau by American soldiers on April 29. Confronted the liberating armies with a reality so extreme that many soldiers found themselves unable to fully process what they were seeing and incapable of describing it adequately to anyone who had not been there. At Bergen-Belsen, British troops found approximately 60,000 prisoners, most in the final stages of starvation, many unable to stand, many already dying from typhus and other diseases, and approximately 13,000 unburied corpses scattered across the camp. The British soldiers who entered the camp described a smell that reached them before the gates did, a visual landscape that had no point of reference in any previous human experience, and a silence among the surviving prisoners that was more disturbing than any sound could have been. General Eisenhower, who visited the camp at Ohrdruf personally, cabled Washington demanding that congressional delegations and journalists be sent immediately to witness what had been found, in order that there shall be no room to claim that this was propaganda. He ordered every American soldier in the surrounding area to tour the facility, understanding that the evidence had to be seen, documented, and placed beyond future denial while it remained in the condition in which the liberators had found it. Film crews and photographers accompanied the delegations. The resulting images were shown in cinemas across Britain and America within weeks. In communities near the camps, Allied commanders organized forced marches of local German civilians to view the evidence directly. Whether the civilian claims of ignorance were genuine, partial, or wholly dishonest remains one of the most debated questions in the historiography of the Third Reich. What is not debated is the specific moral weight that the liberation of the camps placed on the world that witnessed it, a weight expressed in Eisenhower's determination to create an undeniable record that would outlast any future attempt to minimize or deny what had been done. Fact 42, the fall of Berlin, the end of the Reich. The Battle of Berlin, the final Soviet offensive to capture the German capital, launched by Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konov on April 16, 1945, involving approximately 2.5 million Soviet soldiers against approximately 1 million German defenders, including exhausted Wehrmacht units, SS formations, and the Volkster militia of elderly men and teenage boys conscripted in the regime's final desperation. It was one of the most savage urban battles of the entire war and the specific military event that ended the Third Reich as a functioning state. The Soviet assault crossed the Oder River and reached Berlin's outskirts within days, then fought through the city's streets and buildings in a campaign of extreme violence, whose specific character reflected both the tactical demands of urban combat and the specific accumulated rage of an army that had spent 4 years fighting through the trail of destruction the German army had laid across the Soviet Union from Leningrad to Stalingrad. The German civilian population of Berlin, approximately 2 million people who had not evacuated, experienced the battle as a catastrophe of extreme personal violence. By April 25, Berlin was completely encircled. By April 27, Soviet forces were fighting in the streets surrounding the Reich Chancellery. On April 30, with Soviet soldiers in the building above him, Hitler killed himself in the bunker beneath the garden. The specific physical destruction of Berlin, a city reduced to rubble, its streets filled with the dead, its surviving population emerging from cellars into a landscape of absolute devastation, was both the military conclusion of the European war and the visual expression of what happens when a civilization wages war against the world and loses. The city that had been the proud capital of the 1,000-year Reich, now in ruins after 12 years, presented a landscape whose specific desolation was the precise physical correlative of the moral and human catastrophe that had produced it. Fact 43. Hitler's death, the end of the tyrant asterisk. Adolf Hitler spent the final 12 days of his life in the Führerbunker, a concrete shelter 18 meters below the Reich Chancellery Garden in central Berlin, conducting an increasingly disconnected from reality command of a war that had effectively already been lost, issuing orders to armies that no longer existed, denouncing the treachery of generals who were failing to execute the miraculous counterstrokes he was directing on his maps. Alternating between rages of extraordinary violence and episodes of apparent calm, in which he seemed almost resigned to the end he had chosen for himself. He married Eva Braun on the night of April 28 to 29, in a brief ceremony in the bunker map room, and dictated his final political testament, a document in which he blamed the war itself on international Jewry, urged the German people to continue racial struggle, and expressed no remorse for anything he had done. He distributed cyanide capsules to his closest associates and tested the capsule's effectiveness on his dog Blondie. On the afternoon of April 30, 1945, with Soviet forces fighting approximately 400 meters from the bunker entrance and the sounds of their artillery clearly audible from underground, Hitler shot himself in the right temple while simultaneously biting down on a cyanide capsule. Eva Braun died beside him from cyanide alone. Their bodies were carried into the Reich Chancellery Garden, doused with petrol that had been requested the previous day, and burned, a specific instruction Hitler had given, motivated by his having seen photographs of Mussolini's body hanging from a petrol station in Milan. The man who had started the most destructive war in human history, who was personally responsible for the deliberate murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others, died at 56 in an underground room in a destroyed city, with the consequences of his own decisions collapsing around him. Fact 44. Victory in Europe, VE Day. Victory in Europe Day, May 8, 1945, the date on which Germany's unconditional surrender took effect following the signing of the surrender instrument at Reims on May 7, and its ratification in Berlin in the early hours of May 9, was celebrated with an intensity of collective relief and joy in the streets of London, Paris, New York, and Moscow that expressed the specific emotional quality of populations that had endured 5 years and 8 months of the most destructive war in European history. In London, enormous crowds gathered spontaneously in Trafalgar Square, along the embankment, and pressing up against the gates of Buckingham Palace, where King George VI and Queen Elizabeth appeared on the balcony alongside Winston Churchill to acknowledge the crowd's celebration. Churchill addressed the assembled people from a Ministry of Health balcony, telling them, "This is your victory. It is the victory of the cause of freedom in every land." He wept. The specific emotional register of VE Day was more complex than the images of celebration suggest. The war in the Pacific was still being fought and killing people every day. The death camps had just been liberated, and their specific horror was being slowly absorbed by a world that had never seen anything comparable. Millions of displaced persons were scattered across Europe. Prisoners, forced laborers, concentration camp survivors, refugees, with no homes to return to and in many cases no families to return to. The emerging fault lines of the Cold War were already visible in the Allied occupation zones. The joy was genuine, the relief was genuine, and the specific weight of what had been endured to reach this particular morning, the specific knowledge of who was not there to celebrate it, gave the joy a quality that photographs of crowds cannot fully convey. Fact 45, the Manhattan Project, the weapon that changed everything asterisk. The Manhattan Project, the secret American-led scientific and industrial program that developed the first nuclear weapons between 1942 and 1945, employing approximately 130,000 people at facilities across the United States and Canada, costing approximately $2 billion, and culminating in the first successful nuclear detonation at Trinity Site in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945. Was the most consequential scientific and engineering achievement of the entire war, the specific development that most fundamentally and most permanently changed the nature of warfare and the structure of international relations for every decade that followed. The project assembled the most remarkable concentration of scientific talent in human history: Einstein, Fermi, Oppenheimer, Bauer, Feynman, Szilard, and dozens of other leading physicists, many of them Jewish refugees from the European fascism that had driven them to America, under the military direction of General Leslie Groves at a series of sites whose existence was concealed from the general public and from most members of Congress. The specific scientific challenge was not only to achieve a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction, demonstrated by Fermi's Chicago Pile experiment in December 1942, but to design a weapon compact enough to be delivered by aircraft with sufficient reliability to be used in combat. J. Robert Oppenheimer, watching the Trinity test explosion, recalled the line from the Bhagavad Gita that came to him, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The specific moral weight of what had been created was felt immediately and acutely by many of the project's scientists. Petitions were drafted urging a demonstration on an uninhabited area rather than use against a city. The decision was made by political and military leaders, operating under the specific pressures of a war that was still killing thousands of people each day, and whose end by conventional means was projected to cost hundreds of thousands more. Fact 46, Hiroshima, August 6, 1945. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, the American B-29 Enola Gay dropped a uranium bomb designated Little Boy on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, a city of approximately 350,000 people, the headquarters of the Japanese Second Army, and a significant military-industrial center. The bomb detonated approximately 600 meters above the city's center, producing a fireball reaching approximately 4,000 degrees Celsius at its core, a blast wave that flattened approximately 12 square kilometers of the city, and a firestorm that consumed the ruins. Approximately 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed instantly, vaporized, crushed, or burned. A dark shadow was permanently burned into the stone steps of the Sumitomo Bank at the Hypo Center, the outline of a person sitting there at the moment of detonation, consumed so completely that only their shadow remained. By the end of 1945, the death toll had risen to between 90,000 and 166,000, as survivors died of radiation sickness and injuries in a city whose medical infrastructure had been destroyed in the blast. Approximately 90% of Hiroshima's physicians and nurses were among the initial casualties. The Enola Gay's crew, flying at high altitude, saw the city disappear beneath a column of smoke and fire that rose to 18,000 meters. Sergeant Bob Caron, the tail gunner, described the cloud as a bubbling, boiling mass of purple-gray smoke that filled him with a specific terror for which he had no previous frame of reference. President Truman announced the bombing that afternoon, describing it as a harnessing of the basic power of the universe, and warning that if Japan did not accept surrender, it may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on this earth. Japan's military leadership did not surrender. Fact 47, Nagasaki and Japan's surrender. 3 days after Hiroshima, on August 9, 1945, a second atomic bomb, Fat Man, a plutonium implosion device, was dropped on the Japanese city of Nagasaki by the B-29 boxcar piloted by Major Charles Sweeney. The primary target that day was the city of Kokura. It was obscured by cloud cover and smoke from a firebombing raid the previous night, and after 3 failed bombing runs, Sweeney diverted to the secondary target with his fuel running critically low. The bomb detonated over Nagasaki's Urakami Valley, killing between 40,000 and 80,000 people immediately, and between 60,000 and 80,000 by the end of 1945. The same day, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria, fulfilling the Yalta Agreement and removing Japan's last theoretical hope of a negotiated peace through Soviet mediation. Emperor Hirohito, in an imperial conference that extended through the night of August 9 to 10, cast the decisive vote, the first time in Japanese history that an emperor had directly intervened in a government decision in favor of accepting the Allied surrender terms. His recorded radio address on August 15, the first time most Japanese subjects had ever heard his voice, announced the decision in language so oblique that some listeners initially believed it was a declaration of renewed resistance rather than surrender. The formal surrender was signed on September 2, 1945, on the deck of the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. General Douglas MacArthur presided. The Second World War was over. The nuclear age had begun. Fact 48. The Nuremberg Trials, holding power accountable *. The International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, convened from November 1945 to October 1946, in the Palace of Justice in the city that had hosted the Nazi Party's most spectacular pre-war rallies, trying 24 surviving senior leaders of the Nazi German state and military on charges of conspiracy to wage aggressive war, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Was the first international criminal tribunal in history and the founding moment of international humanitarian law as a serious legal enterprise. The tribunal's specific legal innovations were as consequential as any of its verdicts. It established that individuals could be held criminally responsible under international law for acts committed under state orders, that the defense of following orders was not an absolute shield against individual responsibility for atrocities, that aggressive war was itself a crime against the international order, and that sovereign states could be held legally accountable for crimes committed against their own citizens. 12 defendants were sentenced to death and hanged, including Ribbentrop, Keitel, Rosenberg, and Streicher. 7 received prison terms. 3 were acquitted. Hermann Goering, who had dominated the courtroom with his intelligence and aggression throughout the proceedings, cheated the hangman by swallowing a cyanide capsule hours before his scheduled execution. The Nuremberg Principles, written into the Charter of the United Nations and subsequently codified in international law, established the legal framework that would eventually produce the International Criminal Court. They represented humanity's specific determination, in the immediate aftermath of the Holocaust, to assert that the claim of sovereign authority could not provide unlimited cover for the unlimited commission of atrocity. Fact 49. The United Nations, building something better. The United Nations, the international organization established by the charter signed in San Francisco on June 26, 1945, by representatives of 50 nations, as the successor to the failed League of Nations, and as the primary institutional expression of the post-war determination to prevent a recurrence of the catastrophe just concluded, was the most ambitious attempt in human history to organize international relations around shared rules and collective security rather than the unlimited pursuit of national interest by military force. Its founding incorporated the specific lessons that the League's failure had taught. The United States was a founding member rather than a late refusal. The veto rights granted to the Security Councils, 5 permanent members acknowledged that collective security could only function if the most powerful nations were inside the system. The range of specialized agencies, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, UNESCO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, addressed the humanitarian dimensions of international life that the League had left entirely to one side. The UN was not a world government. Its veto structure ensured that the great powers could always block enforcement against themselves or their allies, and the Cold War rapidly demonstrated that Soviet-American antagonism would paralyze the Security Council on the issues that mattered most. But it provided a forum for diplomacy, a set of internationally recognized norms, a mechanism for peacekeeping operations, and an institutional expression of the proposition that the international community had responsibilities to its most vulnerable members that transcended the claims of sovereign authority. It has not prevented war. It has helped contain wars, mediate disputes, deliver humanitarian relief, and maintain a baseline of international communication that has kept the specific catastrophe of a Third World War from occurring in the 8 decades since its founding. Fact 50. The Second World War at 50, halfway through. 50 facts into the story of the Second World War, halfway through, and the war's full arc is visible from beginning to end. The appeasement that enabled Hitler's expansion, the blitzkrieg that shattered France in 6 weeks, the Battle of Britain that delivered his first defeat, the Holocaust whose systematic character expressed the regime's true nature, the turning points of Stalingrad and Alamein and the Atlantic, the liberation of Western Europe and the destruction of Japan, the atomic bomb that ended one era and permanently began another. The specific human cost of the conflict, between 70 and 85 million dead, more than half of them civilians, including 6 million Jews murdered in the most systematic genocide in human history, is a number whose scale resists full comprehension, but demands the specific attempt to comprehend it, because the alternative is to allow the magnitude of the catastrophe to function as an abstraction that protects us from its specific moral weight. Behind every unit of that number is a specific human life that ended, a person who had parents, a name, a history, specific plans for the future that the war made impossible. The 50 facts that remain will carry us through the war's deepest specific stories. The soldiers, the civilians, the resistors and the collaborators, the scientists and the survivors, and through the question that all 100 facts are ultimately building toward. What does a civilization do with the knowledge of what it is capable of, having seen itself at its worst and somehow survived to remember it? This is explored during Sleeping. Fact 51, the firebombing of Japanese cities, a different kind of destruction. The American strategic bombing campaign against Japan, which shifted in March 1945 from high-altitude precision bombing of industrial targets to low-altitude incendiary raids on Japanese cities, under the direction of General Curtis LeMay, who concluded that Japan's dispersed cottage industry production system was more vulnerable to area destruction than to precision attack. Produced in the final months of the Pacific War, a campaign of urban destruction whose specific human cost rivaled, and in some cases exceeded that of the atomic bombs that followed it. The raid on Tokyo on the night of March 9–10, 1945, in which 279 B-29 bombers dropped approximately 1,700 tons of incendiary bombs on the densely packed wooden residential districts of the city, created a firestorm that burned approximately 41 square kilometers of Tokyo, killed an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people in a single night, and left approximately 1 million residents homeless. It was the most destructive conventional air raid in history, killing more people than the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki 5 months later. Similar raids on Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, and 60 other Japanese cities in the following months killed hundreds of thousands of additional civilians and reduced the urban infrastructure of Japan to ash and rubble across an area whose total destruction dwarfed the atomic bomb damage. The specific moral and strategic debate about the firebombing campaign, whether targeting civilian populations was justified by the military objective of breaking Japanese industrial capacity and civilian morale, whether the scale of destruction was proportionate to the military objectives being pursued, was largely subsumed after August 1945 by the specific moral prominence of the atomic bombs, whose individual destructive power made them a more concentrated object of ethical debate than the larger total destruction of the incendiary campaign. The firebombing killed more people than the atomic bombs. It received, and continues to receive, considerably less sustained moral attention. Fact 52, Holocaust survivors, the world after the camps. The approximately 250,000 to 300,000 Jewish survivors, who emerged from the concentration and death camps from hiding, and from the forests and partisan units of Eastern Europe at the war's end, found themselves in a world that had been largely destroyed around them. A world in which their families were dead, their communities had been obliterated, their homes had been occupied or destroyed. And the countries of Eastern Europe to which many attempted to return were in numerous cases hostile to their presence, and in some cases, the sites of continued anti-Jewish violence, including the Kielce pogrom of July 1946 in Poland, in which 42 Jewish survivors were murdered by Polish civilians in a city they had returned to after the war's end. The Allied authorities who liberated the camps were largely unprepared for the specific challenge of caring for survivors, whose physical and psychological condition was beyond anything that conventional medical or social services had been designed to address. Many survivors were held initially in the same camps in which they had been imprisoned, now designated displaced persons camps, whose conditions, though no longer murderous, were inadequate to the specific needs of people who had experienced what the camp survivors had experienced. The political fate of the surviving European Jewish community became one of the most urgent and most contested questions of the immediate post-war period. Many survivors had no desire to remain in Europe, the continent that had produced the Holocaust, that contained the grave of their families, and to which they felt no remaining attachment, and sought immigration to Palestine, then under British mandate, whose immigration restrictions kept many survivors confined to the DP camps for months or years after the war ended. The specific human experience of survival, the guilt of having lived when so many had died, the psychological damage of years of systematic dehumanization, and the specific challenge of rebuilding a life from nothing in a world that did not yet have the conceptual vocabulary to understand what survivors had been through, was a dimension of the Holocaust's aftermath that the world took decades to begin adequately recognizing. Fact 53, the Soviet price, 30 million dead. The The specific human cost of the Second World War to the Soviet Union, approximately 27 to 30 million dead, including approximately 8.7 million military personnel and approximately 19 million civilians, representing approximately 1 in 7 of the entire Soviet population, was a catastrophe of such magnitude that its full dimensions were suppressed by the Soviet government throughout the Cold War period and have been fully acknowledged in Russian public discourse only gradually and incompletely since the Soviet Union's dissolution. No other nation in the history of modern warfare has suffered losses on a comparable scale in a single conflict. The specific character of Soviet civilian losses reflected the explicit German policy of treating the occupied Soviet population as a resource to be exploited and eliminated rather than a people to be governed. Approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity through deliberate starvation and exposure, a policy decision taken at the highest levels of the German military command, based on the specific ideological premise that Slavic lives had no value that required their preservation. The occupied territories of the Western Soviet Union, Ukraine, Belorussia, the Baltic states, experienced a sustained campaign of mass murder, forced labor deportation, and the deliberate destruction of agricultural infrastructure that produced famine conditions, killing millions of civilians over the 4 years of occupation. The specific trauma of these losses shaped Soviet and Russian political culture for generations. The Great Patriotic War, as it was known in the Soviet Union, was not a distant conflict remembered through memorials and films, but a wound so deep and so recent that it remained the defining event in the national consciousness of the peoples who had survived it, shaping their specific attitudes towards security, sovereignty, foreign powers, and the specific willingness to accept authoritarianism in exchange for the promise of protection from an external threat. Fact 54. Crossing the Rhine, the gateway to Germany. The Allied crossing of the Rhine River, the last major natural barrier between the Allied forces advancing from the west and the German heartland, was achieved at multiple points in March 1945 through a combination of deliberate assault crossings and one extraordinary stroke of fortune. The capture intact of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen on March 7, when American soldiers of the 9th Armored Division found the bridge still standing and rushed it before the German demolition charges could be fully detonated, establishing the first Allied bridgehead east of the Rhine. The capture of the Remagen Bridge was one of the war's decisive pieces of operational luck. The Americans had not expected to find a bridge intact and had no plan to exploit what they had found, but the officers on the ground acted with immediate initiative, sending every available soldier across before the Germans could destroy it. Hitler, informed of the failure to destroy the bridge, had the responsible German officers court-martialed and executed. Within 24 hours, an American division was across. Within a week, the bridgehead was large enough to be unstoppable. The subsequent planned crossings, Montgomery's elaborate Operation Plunder in the north on March 23, preceded by the largest airborne drop since Market Garden and a massive artillery bombardment, and Patton's characteristically casual crossing further south, completed the Allied entry into Germany proper. From the Rhine to the Elbe, the German resistance was collapsing everywhere. The Thousand-Year Reich, which had promised eternal German domination of Europe, was going to last exactly 12 years, and in its final weeks it was consuming its last remaining human resources, the teenage boys of the Hitler Youth and the old men of the Volkssturm, in a defense of a cause that had already been lost. Fact 55. The War in China, the Forgotten Theater. The Second World War in China, the conflict between the Chinese Republic and the Empire of Japan that began with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, escalated into full-scale war in 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and continued until Japan's surrender in August 1945, was the longest campaign of the entire Second World War. A conflict of extraordinary scale and extraordinary suffering, whose specific dimensions have been systematically underrepresented in the Western narrative of the war, because most of it was fought before Pearl Harbor brought the Western powers into the Pacific conflict, and because the specific political complexity of the Chinese theater, the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek fighting simultaneously against the Japanese, against the Chinese communist forces of Mao Zedong, and against multiple warlord factions, made it difficult to incorporate into the simpler moral narratives of the war's Allied versus Axis framework. Approximately 15 to 20 million Chinese civilians and soldiers died in the Sino-Japanese War between 1937 and 1945, a human cost that exceeds the total casualties of any Western nation in the entire conflict. The Nanjing Massacre of December 1937, in which Japanese forces killed between 100,000 and 300,000 Chinese civilians and prisoners of war over 6 weeks following the fall of the Chinese capital, was one of the most concentrated single episodes of mass atrocity in the entire war. The specific experience of the Chinese population under Japanese occupation, mass executions, biological warfare experiments conducted on civilian prisoners by Unit 731, the systematic use of forced labor and sexual slavery, represented a campaign of violence against a civilian population that in scale and in deliberateness was comparable to the German war against the Soviet Union. The specific failure of this experience to occupy the same prominent place in the global memory of the Second World War that the European Holocaust and the Pacific Island campaigns occupy reflects not its relative unimportance, but the specific power dynamics of who controls the dominant narratives of historical memory. Fact 56. Churchill's electoral defeat, democracy at work. Winston Churchill's defeat in the British general election of July 26, 1945, in which the Labour Party under Clement Attlee won a landslide majority of 145 seats, removing the man who had led Britain through its most dangerous hours from office before the war against Japan had even formally ended, was one of the most striking demonstrations in modern political history of the specific character of democratic accountability. The willingness of an electorate to vote against the leader who had brought them through their greatest crisis the moment they were confident the crisis was over and had the opportunity to vote for what they wanted next. Churchill was not voted out because the British people had forgotten what he had done. They had not forgotten. They voted Labour because they wanted the National Health Service, affordable housing, full employment, and the welfare state that the Labour manifesto promised, the specific social transformation that the shared sacrifice of the war had made in the view of millions of British voters, not merely desirable but morally necessary. The men who had fought at Alamein and Normandy did not want to return to the unemployment and the class-stratified poverty of the 1930s. The women who had worked in the factories did not want to be told to go home and accept the pre-war social settlement as though nothing had changed. The evacuation of working-class children to middle-class homes had exposed the specific social inequalities of Britain to the communities that had previously been insulated from them. Churchill took the result personally and bitterly. In the long arc of history, the defeat was a tribute to the specific values he had fought the war to protect. The British people demonstrated that they lived in a democracy by exercising it against the man who had saved it. Fact 57. The origins of the Cold War, the alliance fractures. The Cold War, the sustained geopolitical, ideological, and military competition between the United States and the Soviet Union that would define international politics for the next 4 decades, did not begin on a specific date, but emerged from the specific dynamics of the post-war settlement in the months and years following Germany's defeat, as the wartime alliance that had defeated Hitler fractured along the fault lines that had always been present beneath its surface. The specific events that marked the transition from wartime alliance to Cold War confrontation included the Soviet refusal to permit free elections in Poland and the other Eastern European nations, the installation of Soviet-backed communist governments across Eastern Europe between 1945 and 1948, the Soviet blockade of West Berlin in June 1948, the American response of the Berlin airlift that supplied the city by air for 11 months, and the Soviet detonation of its first atomic bomb in August 1949, 3 years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. George Kennan's long telegram of February 1946, sent from the American embassy in Moscow, provided the intellectual framework for the American response. The doctrine of containment, which argued that Soviet expansionism was driven by a combination of ideological commitment and traditional Russian insecurity that could not be accommodated, but could be contained by the consistent demonstration of Western firmness at every point where Soviet pressure was applied. The specific irony of the Cold War's origins was that the alliance that had been assembled to defeat fascism, by defeating fascism so comprehensively that it removed the threat that had made the alliance necessary, created the specific conditions in which the ideological and geopolitical rivalry between its 2 most powerful members could no longer be suppressed by a shared enemy's existence. Fact 58. The Marshall Plan, rebuilding a broken world. The Marshall Plan, the American program of economic assistance to the war-devastated nations of Western Europe, proposed by Secretary of State George Marshall in a commencement address at Harvard University in June 1947, and implemented between 1948 and 1952, providing approximately $13 billion in economic aid to 16 European nations, was the most consequential act of international generosity in the history of modern statecraft, and simultaneously one of the most strategically self-interested. A program whose specific humanitarian objectives, the reconstruction of European economies, shattered by 6 years of total war, served the specific American strategic objective of preventing the economic desperation and political instability that might drive Western European nations toward communism and into the Soviet sphere of influence. The specific economic conditions of Western Europe in 1947 were dire. Industrial production was at a fraction of pre-war levels. Agricultural output was severely depressed. The winter of 1946 to 1947 was the coldest in living memory, disrupting coal production across the continent. Currencies were collapsing, food rationing was continuing 2 years after the war, and the communist parties of France and Italy were polling at historic highs in elections that Western governments watched with specific anxiety. Marshall aid began arriving in 1948, and its specific impact was rapid and transformative. Industrial production in Western Europe reached pre-war levels by 1950 and exceeded them substantially by 1952. The plan's specific requirement that recipient nations cooperate in the administration of aid and coordinate their economic planning created the institutional habits of European economic cooperation that would eventually develop into the European Economic Community and ultimately into the European Union. The Marshall Plan was both an act of genuine generosity and a strategic investment. It was also among the most successful foreign policy initiatives in the history of American diplomacy. Fact 59, the founding of Israel, the war's long shadow asterisk. The establishment of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, proclaimed by David Ben-Gurion in Tel Aviv as the British mandate over Palestine formally ended, recognized within 11 minutes by the United States, and immediately attacked by the armies of Egypt, Transjordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq in the First Arab-Israeli War, was one of the most direct and most consequential political consequences of the Second World War, and specifically of the Holocaust. The event, whose specific demonstration of the vulnerability of Jewish communities within non-Jewish majority states provided the final, irresistible moral argument for the Zionist project of a Jewish national homeland in Palestine, whose realization would otherwise have remained politically contested for decades longer. The specific path from the Holocaust to Israeli statehood ran through the displaced persons camps of Europe, where approximately 250,000 Jewish survivors lived in conditions of continuing uncertainty about their future, the majority having expressed a clear preference for immigration to Palestine. The British government's attempt to maintain immigration restrictions to Palestine, in the context of rising Arab-Jewish violence in the Mandate, produced the specific crisis of the Exodus Affair of July 1947, in which a ship carrying 4,500 Holocaust survivors was turned back from Palestine, and its passengers returned to Germany in a public relations catastrophe that accelerated the British decision to hand the Palestine question to the United Nations. The partition plan adopted by the UN General Assembly in November 1947, allocating approximately 56% of mandatory Palestine to the Jewish state and 44% to the Arab state, was rejected by the Arab states and accepted by the Jewish Agency, setting in motion the sequence of events that produced the 1948 War of Independence and the Palestinian Nakba, the catastrophe, in which approximately 700,000 Palestinian Arabs fled or were expelled from their homes. The wound opened in 1948 has not yet closed. Fact 60, the Second World War at 60, the legacy takes shape. 60 facts into the story of the Second World War, and the war's specific legacy is becoming visible in the world it created. The United Nations and the Nuremberg Principles established the institutional and legal framework of the post-war international order. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe and planted the seeds of European integration. The founding of Israel and the beginning of the Arab-Israeli conflict established one of the defining fault lines of the post-colonial world. The Cold War divided the continent that the war had devastated into two armed camps separated by the Iron Curtain that Winston Churchill described at Fulton, Missouri, in March 1946. The specific technological inheritance of the war, the atomic bomb, the ballistic missile, the jet engine, the electronic computer whose origins lay in the Bletchley Park code-breaking effort, was reshaping the material conditions of human life in ways that would compound and accelerate in the following decades. And the specific moral inheritance of the war, the Holocaust's demonstration of what modern industrial civilization was capable of when directed by an ideology of murderous racial hatred, was producing a body of international law, human rights instruments, and institutional commitments whose specific purpose was to create a world in which such a crime could not be repeated. Whether that purpose was achieved, whether the specific lesson of the Second World War was adequately absorbed by the civilization that survived it, is the question that the 40 facts remaining will approach from the inside of the war's deepest specific stories. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 61. The occupation of Japan, remaking a nation. The American occupation of Japan, the period from August 1945 to April 1952, during which the Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, General Douglas MacArthur, governed Japan from his headquarters in the Daiichi Life Insurance Building in Tokyo, presiding over the most comprehensive transformation of a defeated nation's political, social, and economic institutions ever attempted by any occupying power in modern history, was one of the most consequential political experiments of the entire post-war period, and one whose specific outcomes defied almost every expectation that either the Americans or the Japanese had brought to the encounter. The occupation's core objectives were demilitarization, the permanent dismantling of Japan's military capacity and its imperial political structure, and democratization, the transformation of a society organized around emperor worship, military hierarchy, and the absolute subordination of the individual to the state into a functioning parliamentary democracy capable of sustaining itself after the Americans left. MacArthur, who exercised his authority with a theatrical grandeur that his Japanese hosts found alien and his American subordinates found exhausting, moved with remarkable speed. A new constitution, drafted primarily by American lawyers but adopted by the Japanese Parliament in November 1946, established parliamentary government, universal suffrage, the renunciation of war as a sovereign right, and civilian control of any future military forces. Emperor Hirohito, whose specific culpability for the war's conduct was deliberately not pursued in order to use his authority to legitimize the occupation's reforms, broadcast a statement in January 1946 denying his own divinity, the specific theological claim whose existence had underpinned the entire structure of Japanese imperial ideology. Land reform redistributed agricultural land from landlords to tenant farmers, eliminating the rural economic structure that had sustained the pre-war nationalist movement. Labor unions were legalized, women were given the vote. The Zaibatsu, the great industrial conglomerates that had powered Japan's war economy, were broken up, at least in their original form. The specific success of the occupation in transforming Japan into a stable democracy that would become one of the world's largest economies within 2 decades was not foreordained, and was not without its compromises. The decision not to prosecute Emperor Hirohito, the rehabilitation of wartime industrial and political figures as Cold War allies against Soviet and Chinese communism, and the gradual rearmament that the Korean War made politically necessary all represented accommodations of the occupation's stated principles to the strategic realities of the post-war world. But the fundamental transformation of Japan, from military empire to constitutional democracy, was genuine and proved durable. The specific paradox of the occupation was that the nation most decisively defeated in the Second World War emerged within a generation as one of the most prosperous and most stable democracies in the world. Fact 62. The Berlin Airlift, Cold War's first battle. The Berlin Airlift, the sustained operation by American, British, and French aircraft to supply the western sectors of Berlin by air, following the Soviet blockade of all land and water routes into the city that began on June 24, 1948, and lasted until May 12, 1949, was the first major direct confrontation of the Cold War, the specific test of Western resolve that established the pattern of the subsequent 4 decades of superpower competition, and one of the most extraordinary logistical achievements in the history of aviation. The Soviet blockade was Stalin's response to the Western Allies' introduction of a new currency, the Deutsche Mark, in the Western occupation zones of Germany, a decision the Soviets interpreted as a step toward the permanent division of Germany and the consolidation of a Western-aligned German state. By cutting land access to West Berlin, Stalin calculated that the Western powers would be forced to either negotiate on German currency and governance on Soviet terms, or abandon their sectors of Berlin entirely, surrendering the symbolically crucial presence in the former German capital that sustained Western credibility throughout Germany. What he had not anticipated was that the Western powers would choose a third option, supplying a city of 2 million people entirely by air for 11 months. At the airlift's peak, Allied aircraft were landing at Berlin's Tempelhof Airport at intervals of approximately 90 seconds, carrying coal, food, medicine, and every other commodity required to sustain urban life in a city that had no land connection to the outside world. The logistical achievement required calculating and distributing the calories, fuel, and materials needed to keep 2 million people alive through a Berlin winter, then organizing an air bridge capable of delivering them reliably, was a feat of planning and execution that the men and women who carried it out had no precedent for and had to invent as they proceeded. The airlift delivered approximately 2.3 million tons of supplies over 278,228 flights. 70 Allied airmen and several German civilians died in accidents during the operation. Stalin lifted the blockade on May 12, 1949, having achieved none of his objectives. The specific lesson that Western leaders drew from the airlift, that Soviet pressure could be resisted by sustained collective will without direct military confrontation, became the operational doctrine of containment for the Cold War's subsequent 4 decades. Fact 63, Unit 731, Japan's secret atrocity. Unit 731, the covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, based at the Zhongma Fortress and subsequently at a large facility near Harbin in occupied Manchuria, that between 1935 and 1945 conducted experiments on living human beings of such systematic brutality and on such a scale that they represent. Alongside the Holocaust and the German medical experiments at concentration camps, the most extreme violation of medical ethics in the history of modern science remained largely unknown to the Western world for decades after the war, because the United States government deliberately suppressed its existence in exchange for the research data that its commander, General Shiro Ishii, provided in return for immunity from prosecution. The unit conducted experiments on an estimated 3,000 to 10,000 prisoners, primarily Chinese, Korean and Soviet civilians and prisoners of war, referred to in the unit's documentation as maruta, meaning logs that included deliberate infection with plague, cholera, typhoid, anthrax and other pathogens, vivisection of living subjects without anesthesia, exposure to extreme cold, heat, pressure and radiation, and the development and field testing of biological weapons against Chinese civilian populations. The decision by American authorities in 1947 to grant immunity from war crimes prosecution to Ishii and other Unit 731 personnel in exchange for their research data whose scientific value was assessed by American biological warfare researchers as significant, ensured that the specific crimes of Unit 731 received no judicial reckoning comparable to the Nuremberg medical trial that prosecuted German doctors for similar crimes. The specific data traded for immunity, the results of experiments whose only value derived from the deliberate infliction of suffering on non-consenting human subjects, was subsequently determined by American researchers to be of limited scientific utility, making the moral transaction even more difficult to justify in retrospect. The Japanese government did not formally acknowledge the existence and activities of Unit 731 until 1997, and the specific relationship between the immunity agreement and Japan's failure to fully reckon with its wartime atrocities in the way that Germany has reckoned with the Holocaust remains a significant point of historical and political contention between Japan, China, and Korea. Fact 64, the displaced persons crisis, 40 million uprooted asterisk. The displacement of people produced by the Second World War, the approximately 40 to 60 million individuals across Europe and Asia who were driven from their homes by military operations, genocide, ethnic cleansing, forced labor deportation, and the specific political reorganization of post-war borders, represented the largest refugee crisis in human history and a humanitarian challenge of dimensions that the organizations and governments responsible for managing it were wholly unprepared to address. In Europe alone, approximately 11 million displaced persons were present in Germany at the war's end. Former concentration camp prisoners, forced laborers brought from across occupied Europe, prisoners of war, and the civilian populations displaced by the fighting's advance. The United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, established in 1943 to manage the anticipated post-war displacement, operated approximately 850 displaced persons camps across the Western occupation zones, housing approximately 7 million people by the summer of 1945. Most of the non-Jewish displaced persons were repatriated to their countries of origin within months, but the Jewish survivors and the approximately 2 million Eastern Europeans, Poles, Balts, Ukrainians, who refused repatriation because their home regions were now under Soviet control, or because the communist governments that had taken power in their countries of origin were hostile to their presence, remained in the DP camps for months and in some cases years. The specific conditions of the Jewish DP camps became a political crisis for the British Mandate authorities in Palestine when American and British government investigations found conditions in the camps inadequate and the expressed desire of the majority of Jewish DPs for immigration to Palestine impossible to accommodate within existing British immigration quotas. The specific political pressure generated by the DP crisis was one of the primary factors that drove the United Nations to vote on the partition of Palestine in November 1947, setting in motion the sequence of events that produced the establishment of Israel and the Palestinian Nakba the following year. Fact 65. The war's ordinary soldiers: what combat does to a person. The specific psychological experience of the ordinary combat soldier in the Second World War, the American rifleman in the hedgerows of Normandy, the Soviet infantryman in the ruins of Stalingrad, the German soldier on the Eastern Front in the winter of 1941, the Japanese defender on Iwo Jima watching the American landing craft approach, was one that the armies of every belligerent nation were systematically unprepared to support. That the official commemoration of the war has systematically idealized into a narrative of heroism that does not adequately represent the specific human reality, and that the specific testimony of the men who survived it reveals in dimensions that no general's dispatch and no political leader's speech could capture. Combat is not heroism. Combat is fear managed to the point of functional action, sustained over hours or days or weeks of physical exhaustion and sensory overload, in conditions of mud and cold and heat, and the specific sounds and smells of violent death that do not appear in the official accounts of the battles in which the men experiencing them participated. The American military conducted extensive research into combat fatigue, the Second World War's equivalent of shell shock, and concluded that virtually any soldier exposed to sustained combat for a sufficient period would eventually become a psychiatric casualty. The specific finding that combat effectiveness was maintained only through the rotation of units out of the line for rest, the maintenance of small unit cohesion, and the specific bond between soldiers who had shared extreme experiences together informed the doctrine that the American army eventually developed. But it was never applied consistently enough to prevent the specific breakdown of large numbers of men whose psychological damage was written off as weakness rather than acknowledged as the inevitable consequence of what had been asked of them. The veterans who came home from the war carried with them the specific weight of what they had seen and done, and they carried it largely in silence because the culture that celebrated their victory had no framework for receiving what the victory had actually cost them personally. Fact 66. The war's children, a generation marked. The children of the Second World War, the generation born between approximately 1930 and 1942, who were old enough to experience the war consciously but too young to fight in it, and whose formative years were defined by evacuation, bombing, rationing, the absence of fathers, and the specific psychological weight of a world in which ordinary life had been suspended indefinitely, carried the war's mark in ways whose full dimensions the psychology of the period was not equipped to recognize or address. In Britain, approximately 3.5 million children were evacuated from cities to the countryside between 1939 and 1941, transporting in organized columns to homes in rural areas, whose families received them with varying degrees of welcome, and whose specific social and economic distance from the urban working-class children deposited with them produced encounters of genuine culture shock on both sides. Many evacuee children experienced the evacuation as a form of abandonment, the specific trauma of separation from parents at an age too young to fully understand the necessity of the separation, but old enough to feel its emotional impact, and the psychological consequences of that separation were not taken seriously by the welfare organizations responsible for the children's care. The children of occupied Europe experienced the war in dimensions that the British evacuation experience did not encompass. Jewish children in the ghettos and camps of Eastern Europe experienced a childhood whose specific character was the systematic attempt to kill them. Children in the bombed cities of Germany and Japan experienced the specific terror of aerial attack without the protection of parents in many cases, and the specific disorientation of emerging from shelters into landscapes from which every familiar landmark had been removed. The Soviet children who survived the German occupation of their regions experienced a childhood in which murder, starvation, and systematic brutality were the background conditions of daily life. The specific psychological legacy of these experiences on the generation that subsequently built the post-war world, as parents, as voters, as political leaders, is one of the least studied and most consequential dimensions of the war's human inheritance. Fact 67. The war's technology legacy, what the killing created asterisk. The technological developments accelerated or initiated by the Second World War, the innovations in computing, aviation, medicine, nuclear physics, radar, and communications that the war's specific demands forced into existence or maturity decades before peacetime research could have produced them, represent one of the most consequential and most morally ambiguous inheritances of the entire conflict. a body of technological capability whose post-war civilian applications transformed the material conditions of human life for billions of people who had never experienced the specific violence from which those technologies emerged. The electronic computer, whose fundamental conceptual architecture was developed by Alan Turing in the context of the Enigma code-breaking effort, and whose first practical implementations were the Colossus machines built at Bletchley Park to break the German Lorentz cipher, was the most transformative single technological inheritance of the war. Without the war's specific demand for automated cipher analysis at a speed beyond human calculation, the development of the programmable electronic computer might have been delayed by decades. The radar systems developed by British scientists in the late 1930s and deployed to decisive effect in the Battle of Britain became the foundation of the civil aviation industry's air traffic control systems, the weather forecasting networks, and the navigation systems that made mass air travel possible in the post-war decades. The jet engine, developed simultaneously and independently by Frank Whittle in Britain and Hans von Ohain in Germany, both under the pressure of military requirements, transformed commercial aviation within a decade of the war's end, shrinking the world in ways that no previous transportation technology had approached. The nuclear technology that produced the bombs that ended the war also produced the nuclear power industry, and in the Cold War's nuclear arms race, the specific terror that paradoxically may have prevented a Third World War by making the consequences of one too catastrophic to rationally contemplate. The penicillin production capacity, developed under wartime pressure to treat the infected wounds of millions of soldiers, became the foundation of the antibiotic revolution that transformed the treatment of infectious disease for the entire human population. Fact 68, the Nuremberg doctor's trial, when medicine became murder *. The doctor's trial at Nuremberg, the first of the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials held by the American Military Tribunal in 1946 and 1947, in which 23 German physicians and medical administrators were tried for war crimes and crimes against humanity, arising from their participation in the systematic medical experiments conducted on concentration camp prisoners and in the T4 euthanasia program that murdered approximately 200,000 German citizens with physical and mental disabilities, was the most direct legal confrontation with the specific violation of medical ethics that the Nazi regime had organized at the intersection of ideological racial theory and modern scientific methodology. The experiments conducted by the defendants included high-altitude experiments to determine the limits of human survival at altitude and extreme cold, conducted in pressure chambers and in tanks of near-freezing water, malaria experiments in which prisoners were infected with malaria and subjected to experimental drug treatments, sulfanilamide experiments in which wounds were deliberately infected with bacteria, and bone transplant experiments in which bones, nerves, and muscles were removed from prisoners without anesthesia. The specific defense offered by the accused physicians, that the experiments were conducted on condemned persons and therefore involved no additional harm, that prisoners had consented, and that similar experiments had been conducted by American and British researchers, was rejected by the tribunal on grounds that no person subjected to the conditions of the concentration camp could meaningfully consent to anything, and that the experimental protocol violated the basic ethical obligations of the medical profession that the defendants had sworn to uphold. 10 of the 23 defendants were sentenced to death and hanged. The trial's lasting legacy was the Nuremberg Code, a set of 10 principles for the ethical conduct of human medical experiments that became the foundation of the Declaration of Helsinki and the entire subsequent framework of research ethics governing medical experimentation on human subjects worldwide. The specific evil of the Nazi medical program had produced, through the legal reckoning it required, the ethical standards that were intended to ensure it could not be repeated. Fact 69, the end of empire, the war that decolonized the world *. The Second World War was the primary catalyst for the decolonization of the European empires that had governed approximately a third of the world's land surface and population at the war's beginning, a process that transformed the political map of Asia and Africa in the 2 decades following 1945, and that was driven by the specific intersection of the war's ideological claims about freedom and self-determination. The specific military and economic exhaustion of the European colonial powers, and the specific political awakening of colonial peoples who had participated in a war fought in the name of values that their colonial status denied them. Britain's Indian Army, which provided 2.5 million volunteer soldiers, the largest volunteer force in the history of warfare, fought and died for the Allied cause in North Africa, Italy, and Burma, and its veterans returned to India with the specific political consciousness of men who had been asked to sacrifice everything for freedoms that the British Empire denied to the people they came from. The specific shock of the fall of Singapore in February 1942, the rapid collapse of the supposedly impregnable British fortress before Japanese forces, destroyed the myth of European military invincibility that had sustained colonial authority throughout Asia more than any political argument could have. Indian independence in August 1947, negotiated by the Labour government that had swept Churchill from power, was the first and most consequential of the post-war decolonisation events. It was followed by the independence of Burma and Ceylon in 1948, by the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in Vietnam in 1954, by the Suez Crisis of 1956 that demonstrated Britain's and France's inability to act independently of American approval, and by the wave of African independence that began in 1957 with Ghana and continued through the early 1960s. The war that the European imperial powers had fought in the name of freedom produced a world in which the continuation of their empires was both morally and practically impossible. Fact 70, the Second World War at 70, 30 facts from the end. 70 facts into the story of the Second World War, and the war's legacy in the world we actually inhabit is visible in all its long-term consequence. The specific institutions it produced, the United Nations, the Nuremberg Principles, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted in 1948, established the normative framework of the international order within which every subsequent generation has had to navigate. The specific technology it accelerated, the computer, the jet engine, the nuclear reactor, the antibiotic, transformed the material conditions of human life more rapidly than any previous technological transition. The specific political transformations it produced, the decolonization of Asia and Africa, the establishment of Israel, the division of Europe by the Iron Curtain, the bipolar structure of the Cold War, shaped the specific conflicts and the specific alignments that define the second half of the 20th century. And the specific moral inheritance it left, the Holocaust's undeniable demonstration of what modern bureaucratic civilization could do when directed by an ideology of extermination. Inscribed in international law at Nuremberg and in the Genocide Convention of 1948, established the standard against which every subsequent atrocity has been measured and found either to meet or to fall short of the threshold that demands the specific response of never again. Whether that response has been adequate, whether the specific lessons of the Second World War have been sufficiently absorbed by the civilization that survived it, is the question that the 30 facts remaining will approach through the specific stories of the war's deepest human dimensions. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 71, the Burma Campaign, the Forgotten Army. The Burma Campaign, the Allied military operations conducted in the jungles and mountains of Burma between 1942 and 1945, involving the British 14th Army under General William Slim, Indian, African, and Chinese forces, and American air units against Japanese forces that had captured Burma in 1942 and held it as a barrier protecting the western approaches to their Southeast Asian empire, was the longest land campaign fought by British and Commonwealth forces in the entire Second World War, and the one that received the least attention from the British press, the British public, and the British political establishment, earning the men who fought it the specific designation they gave themselves, the Forgotten Army. The campaign was fought in conditions of extreme physical hardship that made the jungles of Burma one of the most demanding military environments of the entire war. The monsoon rains flooded rivers to impassable levels for months at a time. The heat and humidity were debilitating. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, and a range of tropical diseases killed more men in the early stages of the campaign than Japanese bullets, and the specific challenge of supplying forces operating in roadless jungle hundreds of miles from any port required logistical solutions, including the massive expansion of air supply operations over the hump across the Himalayas to China, whose difficulty has never been adequately represented in the popular narrative of the war. General Slim, who transformed the demoralized force that had been driven out of Burma in 1942 into the army that reconquered it in 1945, was in the assessment of many military historians the finest operational commander the British Army produced in the entire war, a leader who understood his soldiers' specific psychological needs as clearly as he understood the operational requirements of jungle warfare, and who rebuilt both simultaneously through a combination of tactical innovation, logistical reform, and the specific kind of personal leadership that persuades men fighting in hell that their sacrifice has purpose, and their commander knows what he is doing. The reconquest of Burma culminated in the crossing of the Irrawaddy River in February 1945, and the recapture of Rangoon in May, achievements of genuine military brilliance that were reported in the British press beneath the fold, if at all. Fact 72. Soviet women at war, half of the army. The role of women in the Soviet military during the Second World War. Approximately 800,000 Soviet women served in the Red Army between 1941 and 1945, in combat and support roles of every description, including as fighter pilots, snipers, tank crew, artillery operators, and infantry soldiers fighting in the frontline conditions of the Eastern Front. It was unique among all the major belligerent nations in the scale and the directness of women's combat participation, and reflected both the specific ideological commitment of the Soviet state to gender equality in military service and the specific desperation of a nation fighting for its survival against an enemy whose initial offensives had destroyed enormous portions of its military capacity. The most celebrated of the Soviet women's military formations was the 588th Night Bomber Regiment, known to the Germans as the Nachtsechsen, the Night Witches, a regiment composed entirely of women pilots who flew Aging Polikarpov Po-2 biplane trainers on nocturnal bombing missions against German positions throughout the Eastern Front campaign. The specific tactics the Night Witches developed to compensate for their aircraft's limitations, approaching the target at altitude, cutting the engine to glide in silence above the German positions, dropping their bombs, and restarting the engine to escape, required exceptional flying skill and physical courage in an aircraft whose open cockpit and wooden frame provided no protection against the anti-aircraft fire below or the fighters scrambled to intercept them. The regiment flew approximately 30,000 sorties over the course of the war, earning 23 Hero of the Soviet Union designations, the highest Soviet military honor. Soviet women snipers, of whom approximately 2,000 served in the Red Army, were among the most effective practitioners of their specific skill in the entire war. Lyudmila Pavlichenko, with 309 confirmed kills, was the most successful female sniper in military history. When she toured the United States in 1942 as a goodwill ambassador, the American press expressed surprise at her appearance. She did not look like a killer, they said. She responded that she had not come to the United States to be assessed on her appearance. Fact 73. The Holocaust and the bystanders, those who watched. The Holocaust was not committed in secret. It was committed in the presence of millions of people who were not its perpetrators and not its victims, the ordinary citizens of Germany and occupied Europe who lived alongside the deportations, who saw the columns of Jewish prisoners marching through their towns, who took over the apartments vacated by their Jewish neighbors' removal, who benefited from the economic expropriation of Jewish property, and who made the specific daily choices between intervention, protest, silent complicity. An active collaboration that the Holocaust's operation required of those who witnessed it. The specific question of what ordinary people knew and when they knew it, and what the relationship between knowledge and moral responsibility was in the specific conditions of totalitarian occupation, is one of the most difficult and most important questions that the history of the Holocaust raises, and one whose honest engagement requires acknowledging that the answer varies enormously across different national, social, and individual contexts in ways that resist any simple generalization. In Germany itself, the regime's specific effort to document and publicize its persecution of Jews in the 1930s, the Nuremberg Laws, Kristallnacht, the forced wearing of the yellow star, ensured that the general fact of Jewish persecution was public knowledge. The specific fact of systematic mass murder in the death camps of occupied Poland was less widely known within Germany, but was not entirely unknown. Returning soldiers, SS personnel on leave, railway workers involved in the deportations, and the civilian employees of the Eastern Occupying Administration all had specific knowledge that passed, in attenuated form, through conversations and letters into the broader German civilian population. The specific moral question, what obligation rested on those who knew or suspected what was happening, and how many people fulfilled that obligation, does not have a comfortable answer. The thousands of individuals across occupied Europe who hid Jewish neighbors at mortal risk to themselves, the people commemorated at Yad Vashem as righteous among the nations, demonstrate that the choice to resist existed. That most people made a different choice does not simplify the moral landscape. It deepens it. Fact 74. The Pacific Submarine War, Silent Service, Decisive Impact. The American submarine campaign in the Pacific, the sustained effort by the United States Navy's submarine force to strangle Japan's maritime supply lines by sinking the merchant shipping that carried the oil, iron ore, food and raw materials without which Japan's war economy could not function. was one of the most strategically decisive campaigns of the entire Pacific War, and one of the least celebrated. A campaign fought entirely out of public view, in the specific claustrophobic environment of a submerged submarine operating under conditions of extreme danger, that contributed more directly to the economic collapse of Japan's war effort than any surface naval engagement or island campaign. Japan was an island nation, utterly dependent on maritime trade for the raw materials its industry required. Its pre-war oil supply came almost entirely from the Dutch East Indies, its iron ore from China and Malaya, its food supplements from Korea and the occupied Pacific territories. Cut those supply lines, and Japan's industry would stop, its military would be unable to fuel and equip its forces, and its civilian population would face starvation. The American submarine force, which began the war with defective torpedoes that frequently failed to detonate and doctrine that emphasized caution over aggression, corrected both problems by 1943 and spent the war's final 2 years systematically destroying Japan's merchant fleet. By August 1945, approximately 60% of Japan's merchant tonnage had been sunk. Oil imports had fallen to approximately 10% of their 1941 levels, and Japan's industrial production was collapsing from the combined effects of fuel shortage and raw material starvation. Human cost of this achievement was significant. Approximately 3,500 American submariners were killed, a casualty rate of approximately 22%, the highest of any branch of the American armed forces in the Pacific War. They wore no insignia, their operations were classified, and their specific contribution to the war's outcome received less public attention than the dramatic carrier battles and island landings that dominated the media coverage of the Pacific War. Fact 75: Allied prisoners of Japan, survival and its price. The approximately 140,000 Western Allied prisoners of war held by Japan during the Second World War, captured primarily at Singapore, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, and in the Dutch East Indies in the first months of the Pacific War, experienced a captivity whose specific conditions of deliberate brutality, systematic starvation, forced labor, and casual violence produced a mortality rate of approximately 27%. A rate more than 7 times higher than the death rate for Western Allied prisoners held by Germany and Italy, and one that reflected the specific character of the Japanese military's attitude towards surrender, which its own code of Bushido treated as the ultimate dishonor, and which generated in the treatment of prisoners who had surrendered a specific contempt that was institutionalized at every level of the prison camp system. The most notorious single episode of prisoner mistreatment was the Bataan Death March of April 1942, in which approximately 75,000 Filipino and American prisoners captured at the fall of Bataan on Luzon were forced to march approximately 130 kilometers to prisoner of war camps under conditions of deliberate cruelty. Prisoners who fell were bayoneted or beheaded. Those who stopped to drink from roadside ditches were beaten or killed. Those who asked for water or food were punished, killing approximately 5,000 to 18,000 men in the course of the march and in the immediate aftermath. The Burma-Thailand Railway, the 415-kilometer railway, forced labor construction project that used approximately 61,000 Allied prisoners and 200,000 Asian laborers, killing approximately 12,000 Allied prisoners and 80,000 to 100,000 Asian laborers from overwork, disease, and violence in the construction of what became known as the Death Railway, was the most sustained single episode of prisoner mistreatment in the Pacific War's history. The survivors who returned from Japanese captivity carried psychological and physical damage, whose severity the medical and welfare systems of their home countries were wholly unprepared to address, and whose specific character, the combination of systematic dehumanization, starvation, and the arbitrary violence of a captivity in which any guard could kill any prisoner without consequence, produced a form of trauma that the limited psychological vocabulary of 1945 classified as adjustment difficulty, and the soldiers themselves were expected to resolve by returning to normal life. Fact 76: The atomic bomb decision, the hardest question. The decision to use atomic bombs against the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, made by President Harry Truman in consultation with his Secretary of War Henry Stimson, Secretary of State James Byers, and the military leadership of the armed forces, is the most intensively debated single decision in the history of modern warfare, and one whose specific moral complexity has not diminished in the 8 decades since it was made. As successive generations of historians, philosophers, military strategists, and ordinary citizens have argued from the evidence about whether using the bombs was necessary, whether it was justified, and what the alternatives would have cost. The case for the decision rests primarily on the specific evidence from the battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. that Japanese military culture made surrender effectively impossible as long as the home islands remained unoccupied, that an invasion of Kyushu in November 1945 would have cost between 250,000 and over 1 million American casualties, and potentially several million Japanese dead in fighting and in the continuation of the firebombing campaign, and that the atomic bombs, by providing the emperor with a force majeure that his military leadership could not argue against. Not human failure, but an act of godlike destruction against which continued resistance was meaningless, made a Japanese decision to surrender possible in a way that conventional military pressure had failed to produce. The case against rests on the specific facts that Japan was already effectively defeated, that the naval blockade was producing starvation conditions that would have forced surrender without an invasion, that the Soviet declaration of war on August 8 was a greater shock to the Japanese military than the atomic bombs, and that the targeting of civilian cities was a moral violation that the military necessity argument does not adequately justify. Both cases are made by serious historians using the same evidence. The specific weight of the decision, its moral gravity, its specific human consequences in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and its permanent transformation of warfare is not diminished by the ambiguity of its justification. It may, in fact, be deepened by it. Fact 77, the bombing of Dresden, the question that won't go away. The Allied bombing of Dresden, the historic Saxon city in eastern Germany, struck by British and American bombers in 4 raids over the nights of February 13 to 14 and the days of February 14 to 15, 1945, destroying approximately 1,600 acres of the city centre and killing an estimated 22,700 to 25,000 people in firestorms whose specific character was shaped by the same atmospheric and architectural conditions that made the Hamburg firestorm of 1943 so catastrophic, has been the most persistently debated of all the Allied strategic bombing operations. The specific act that has most directly focused the moral question of whether the deliberate targeting of civilian areas in the service of military objectives constitutes a war crime, regardless of the identity of the party conducting it. Dresden in February 1945 was not an innocent city. It contained significant railway marshalling yards used to supply the German forces on the Eastern Front. It housed military headquarters. It contained industrial facilities producing optical equipment and other war materials. The claim, propagated by the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels and subsequently amplified by Allied critics and Cold War East German propaganda, that Dresden was an open city of purely cultural significance with no military value, was false. The specific moral question is not whether Dresden had military value, but whether the scale of the attack, the specific decision to create a firestorm in a densely populated city center, rather than to target its military and industrial facilities with the precision bombing methods that the American daylight bombing campaign was simultaneously developing, was proportionate to the military objectives being pursued at this specific stage of a war that was already clearly in its final weeks. The RAF's area bombing doctrine, which had been deliberately targeting German civilian population centers since 1942 as a means of destroying civilian morale, produced at Dresden an operation whose specific cost in civilian life was both real and, in the specific military context of February 1945, difficult to justify as a necessary contribution to the war's conclusion. Fact 78, the war's photographers witnessing history. The photographers and film cameramen who documented the Second World War, the men and women who carried cameras into combat zones, into the liberated death camps, onto the beaches of Normandy and Iwo Jima, and into the ruins of bombed cities, created the visual archive through which the war has been known by every generation that has encountered it since, and whose specific images have shaped the moral and emotional understanding of the conflict more powerfully than any written account. Robert Capa, the Hungarian-born photographer who covered the Spanish Civil War, the Normandy landing, the liberation of Paris, and 5 wars in total before stepping on a landmine in Indochina in 1954, produced at Omaha Beach on June 6, 1944, a series of photographs whose specific technical imperfection has become their aesthetic strength. 11 photographs survived from the dozen rolls he shot in the water beside the landing craft, the rest destroyed by a darkroom technician's error, and the 11 survivors are grainy, slightly blurred images of soldiers struggling through surf under fire, whose specific quality of movement and chaos captures the specific experience of combat more honestly than any technically perfect image could have achieved. The photograph of the flag raising on Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi, taken by Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press on February 23, 1945, became the most reproduced photograph of the entire war and the basis for the Marine Corps War Memorial in Washington. It was staged, not posed, as has been falsely claimed, but a re-raising of a flag that had been raised once already. A specific historical fact that does not diminish the image's emotional power or its documentary truth about the character of the Pacific Island campaign. The photographs taken at Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald and Dachau in April 1945, images of the living and the dead in conditions of degradation that the human eye had no previous experience of preparing it to receive, fulfilled Eisenhower's specific intention of creating an undeniable visual record. They still fulfill that intention. They cannot be looked at without being changed. Fact 79, the war's legacy in international law, never again as legal principle. The specific legal architecture constructed in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, the Nuremberg Principles, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in December 1948, the Genocide Convention of the same month, and the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, represented the most ambitious attempt in human history to encode the specific moral lessons of a catastrophe into binding international legal instruments, whose purpose was to prevent its repetition, and whose specific provisions reflected the particular horrors of the war, just concluded with a directness that left no ambiguity about the experiences that had inspired them. The Genocide Convention, drafted under the leadership of Raphael Lemkin, the Polish Jewish lawyer who had coined the word genocide in 1944, and who had personally lost 49 members of his own family in the Holocaust, defined genocide as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group, and obligated signatory states to prevent and punish it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, drafted by a committee chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt and drawing on legal and philosophical traditions from across the world's cultures, established for the first time a set of rights belonging to every human being by virtue of their humanity, not their citizenship, that no state could legitimately violate. The Geneva Conventions codified the protections due to wounded soldiers, prisoners of war, and civilian populations in armed conflict, in terms that directly responded to the specific violations the war had produced. None of these instruments prevented subsequent genocides. None of them created the enforcement mechanisms that would have made their provisions reliably effective. But they established the normative framework, the specific claim that certain acts were crimes against humanity regardless of state sanction, within which every subsequent international legal and humanitarian effort has operated, and without which the concept of international accountability for mass atrocity could not have developed as it has. Fact 80, the Second World War at 80, 20 facts from the end. 80 facts into the story of the Second World War, 20 facts from the end, and the war's full human texture is visible in all its dimensions. The forgotten army in the Burmese jungle and the night witches above the Eastern Front, the bystanders who watched and the righteous who resisted, the submariners who won a decisive campaign in silence, and the prisoners who survived a captivity designed to kill them. The photographers who witnessed and the lawyers who prosecuted, and the diplomats who tried to build something better from the wreckage. The specific human stories that these 20 remaining facts will complete are the ones that connect the vast impersonal scale of the war's statistics: 85 million dead, 40 million displaced, 6 million murdered in the Holocaust, to the specific lives that were lived, interrupted, and ended inside those numbers. The war's meaning is not located in its strategic turning points or its political consequences, important as those are. It is located in the specific human experience of the people who lived through it, in what they chose, what they endured, what they lost, and what they made from what remained. 20 facts remain. They will complete the story not by resolving the war's moral complexity, which does not resolve, but by honoring the full weight of what happened and the full range of what was lost. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 81, the War in the Pacific, MacArthur's Return. General Douglas MacArthur, the American commander who had been ordered to leave the Philippines in March 1942, as Japanese forces closed in on the final Allied defenses at Bataan and Corregidor, who had vowed, "I shall return upon reaching Australia," and who waded ashore at Leyte in October 1944 to fulfill that promise in a moment of theatrical self-dramatization that he ensured, was photographed from multiple angles and broadcast to the world. Was the most complex and most controversial Allied commander of the entire Pacific War. A figure of genuine strategic vision, extraordinary personal courage, and a theatrical egotism so complete that it sometimes made objective military judgment genuinely difficult, and whose specific relationship with the soldiers who served under him oscillated between the intense personal loyalty that charismatic commanders generate and the specific resentment of men who believed, with evidence, that their commander prioritized his personal reputation above their welfare. MacArthur's campaign to liberate the Philippines, a strategic priority he had championed against the alternative of bypassing the archipelago entirely in favor of a more direct approach to Japan, consumed approximately 10 months of fighting from October 1944 to August 1945, and produced approximately 62,000 American casualties, alongside the deaths of an estimated 500,000 Filipino civilians in fighting whose character in the cities was particularly savage. The Battle of Manila in February 1945, in which Japanese forces trapped in the city fought a desperate defense that produced approximately 100,000 Filipino civilian deaths, was one of the most destructive urban battles of the entire Pacific War. Reducing a city of colonial architectural beauty to rubble in a month of fighting, whose specific cost in civilian life has never received the attention that the drama of the liberation narrative has consistently overshadowed. MacArthur's subsequent role as Supreme Commander of the Allied occupation of Japan, where his specific combination of imperious authority and genuine administrative talent transformed a defeated empire into a functioning democracy, was arguably a more consequential contribution to the war's ultimate outcome than any of his military campaigns. Fact 82. Resistance in the camps, dignity against extermination. The acts of resistance that occurred within the Nazi concentration and extermination camps, ranging from the deliberate slowing of forced labor to the concealment of food and medicines, from the maintenance of secret religious observance to the preservation of documentary evidence of what was happening, and culminating in the armed uprisings at Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz-Birkenau that have been systematically underrepresented in the popular narrative of the Holocaust, constitute one of the most important and most frequently misunderstood dimensions of the Holocaust's history, a dimension whose recovery is essential not only for historical completeness, but for the specific moral purpose of refusing the specific dehumanization that the Nazi system intended by insisting on the full agency and the full humanity of its victims. The armed uprising at the Sobibor extermination camp on October 14, 1943, organized by the Soviet Jewish prisoner of war Alexander Petchesky in coordination with the camp's underground resistance, killed 11 SS guards, wounded several more, and enabled approximately 300 prisoners to escape through the camp's perimeter fence, of whom approximately 50 survived the war. The uprising at Treblinka on August 2, 1943, in which approximately 700 prisoners who had obtained weapons from the camp's armory through months of careful preparation, launched a coordinated attack, killed several guards, set fire to camp buildings, and enabled approximately 200 prisoners to escape, of whom approximately 70 survived. The Sonderkommando uprising at Auschwitz-Birkenau on October 7, 1944, in which the prisoners forced to operate the crematoria, using explosives smuggled into the camp by Jewish women working in a munitions factory, destroyed one of the 4 gas chambers and killed several SS guards, was the largest single armed act of resistance within any Nazi killing facility. All the Sonderkommando who participated were killed. The act of resistance was not diminished by its outcome. The women who smuggled the explosives, Rosa Robota, Esther Wajtblom, Regina Safastajan, and Ala Gertner, were hanged at Auschwitz in January 1945. Rosa Robota's last message to her comrades in the camp read, "Be strong, have courage." Fact 83. The war's journalists' words from the front. The journalists who reported the Second World War, the correspondents, radio broadcasters, and newspaper reporters who covered the conflict from its outbreak in September 1939 to its conclusion in August 1945, filing dispatches from every theater of operations under conditions of military censorship, physical danger, and the specific psychological demands of witnessing sustained violence, and then transmitting its human reality to audiences whose experience of the war was defined by what the journalists chose to say and how they chose to say it, created the narrative through which the war was experienced by the civilian populations of the Allied nations, and whose specific choices of emphasis, language, and framing shaped the moral and emotional understanding of the conflict in ways whose influence has persisted to the present. Ernie Pyle, the Scripps Howard correspondent who covered the war in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and the Pacific from the perspective of the ordinary infantry soldier, sleeping in the same conditions, eating the same food, and writing about the specific human beings he encountered with a directness and a warmth that made his columns the most widely read in America, was the journalist who most successfully translated the specific experience of combat into language that the civilians at home could emotionally inhabit. His dispatches avoided the heroic abstractions of official military communication, in favor of the specific names and specific stories of specific soldiers. The column he wrote about the death of Captain Henry Waskow of Belton, Texas, in which he described the men of Waskow's company coming down the mountain at night to say goodbye to their captain's body, was described by a congressional committee as the finest piece of writing to come out of the war. Pyle was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on the island of Aishima in April 1945, and the specific shock of his death, felt by an American public that had followed his dispatches for 4 years, with the specific attachment readers develop for writers who have made them feel that the person writing to them genuinely understands what they are being told, was itself a measure of what journalism at its best can accomplish in the context of a war. Fact 84. The Holocaust's long shadow, memory, denial, and reckoning. The specific process by which the Holocaust has been remembered, denied, minimized, and eventually established as the defining atrocity of the 20th century in the consciousness of Western civilization, a process that took decades to reach the level of public acknowledgement and institutional commitment that now characterizes the major Western democracies, reveals as much about the psychology of collective memory and the politics of historical guilt as it does about the historical events themselves, and whose specific trajectory from the partial silence of the immediate post-war years to the Holocaust's current status as the primary moral reference point of modern Western political discourse has involved struggles of advocacy, scholarship, and legal confrontation that are themselves part of the history. In the immediate post-war years, the Holocaust was not absent from public consciousness, but it was not yet central to it. The Nuremberg trials documented it extensively, the newsreel footage from the liberated camps was shown widely, and a significant body of survivor testimony was being collected. But the specific political priorities of the Cold War, the need to reintegrate West Germany as an ally against the Soviet Union, the focus of American political energy on the communist threat, and the specific difficulty experienced by survivors in finding audiences willing to absorb what they had to say, meant that the Holocaust's full dimensions were not the subject of sustained public attention in the 1950s that they would become in the 1960s. The trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, in which the architect of the deportation logistics of the final solution sat in a glass booth in a Jerusalem courtroom and was convicted and executed after testimony from 112 Holocaust survivors broadcast live on television across the world, was the specific event that brought the Holocaust out of the documentary record and into the emotional reality of a generation that had been too young to experience the war directly. Hannah Arendt's report on the Eichmann trial produced the concept of the banality of evil, the specific insight that the most extreme evil in history had been organized and implemented not by demonic monsters, but by ordinary bureaucratic functionaries whose specific capacity for moral abdication in the service of institutional obedience was the most disturbing fact about them. Fact 85. The war's veterans coming home. The approximately 16 million Americans who served in the armed forces during the Second World War, and the tens of millions of veterans of every other belligerent nation who returned from the war's various theaters to the civilian lives that the war had interrupted, came home to a world that was simultaneously eager to celebrate their service and comprehensively unprepared to understand what that service had actually involved, and whose specific desire to return to normality after years of sacrifice created a social pressure on veterans to set aside their specific experiences and resume their pre-war roles as workers, husbands, and citizens that left the specific psychological damage of combat experience largely unaddressed for a generation. The American GI Bill of Rights, the Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944, which provided veterans with college education, vocational training, low-cost mortgages, and unemployment benefits, was the most consequential single piece of domestic legislation produced by the war, and its specific effects on American society were transformational. Approximately 2.3 million veterans attended college under the GI Bill, creating the educated professional class that built the post-war American economy. Approximately 3.7 million home loans were guaranteed, creating the suburban communities that defined post-war American geography. The GI Bill's specific exclusion of black veterans from many of its benefits, through the racist administration of mortgage lending by private banks, the segregation of many universities in the southern states, and the specific discrimination of the Veterans Administration offices that processed claims, meant that the bill's transformational benefits flowed overwhelmingly to white veterans, deepening rather than reducing the racial wealth gap that the war's black soldiers had fought to eliminate. The veterans who came home from the war and said nothing about what they had seen, who put on civilian clothes, went back to work, married and had children and built the suburbs, and did not speak about what they had experienced in the Pacific or in Europe, were not suppressing the past out of indifference. They were managing, as best they could with the specific psychological tools available to them in 1945, experiences that the world they had returned to was not yet equipped to receive. Fact 86. The war's diplomats, the peace architects. The diplomats and statesmen who negotiated the peace settlements and international institutions of the post-war period, the men and women who worked in the conference rooms of San Francisco, Paris, London, and New York to translate the military outcome of the war into a durable political order, were operating under the specific historical pressure of knowing that their predecessors at Paris in 1919 had made agreements whose failures had produced the catastrophe just concluded, and that the specific task of building better was not merely a diplomatic challenge, but a moral obligation of the first order. The specific lessons that the architects of the post-war order drew from the Versailles settlement were direct and deliberately applied. The United States would not retreat into isolationism as it had in 1919, but would take a leading role in constructing and sustaining the international institutions its absence had fatally weakened. Germany would not be humiliated and impoverished in ways that generated the resentment Hitler had exploited, but would be democratized, denazified, and eventually integrated as a partner in the Western Alliance. The principle of national self-determination would be more consistently applied, even when its consistent application, in Asia and Africa, as well as Europe, required the dismantling of the colonial empires that the victorious democracies had spent the previous century constructing. The specific achievement of the post-war diplomatic settlement, the United Nations, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the European Coal and Steel Community that became the European Economic Community, and ultimately the European Union, was not a perfect peace. The Cold War divided Europe and produced proxy conflicts across Asia, Africa, and Latin America that killed millions of people in the following decades. But it preserved the specific thing that the First World War's failed peace had not preserved: the conditions for stable democratic governance in Western Europe and for sustained economic growth that made the specific poverty and desperation that had fueled fascism politically untenable for the first time in a century. Fact 87. The war's scientists, knowledge in service of destruction. The scientists of the Second World War, the physicists, chemists, engineers, and mathematicians whose specific intellectual capabilities were mobilized by the belligerent governments in service of military objectives, whose specific character ranged from the defensively protective to the unambiguously murderous, occupy a uniquely complex moral position in the history of the conflict. Human beings whose specific contributions to the war's outcome were decisive and whose specific moral responsibility for the consequences of those contributions has been debated ever since with a seriousness that reflects the specific power of scientific knowledge to transform the scale and character of human violence. The physicists of the Manhattan Project, many of them liberal Democrats whose initial motivation for joining the project was the specific fear that Nazi Germany was developing its own atomic bomb, and that an Allied bomb was therefore a defensive necessity, found themselves in August 1945 having contributed to weapons used against a Japanese civilian population at a time when Germany, whose theoretical atomic program had in fact never come close to producing a weapon, had already surrendered. J. Robert Oppenheimer's subsequent opposition to the development of the hydrogen bomb, a weapon whose destructive potential made the Hiroshima bomb seem modest, resulted in his security clearance being revoked in 1954, in a process widely regarded as a political persecution, driven by his opposition to specific Cold War nuclear policies. Werner Heisenberg, who led the German atomic program, claimed after the war that he had deliberately slowed the German bomb project on moral grounds, a claim whose specific credibility has been disputed by physicists who had access to the farm hall transcripts of conversations recorded when Heisenberg and other German scientists were interned in England after the war. The specific question of what moral responsibilities scientists bear for the military applications of their work, raised with acute urgency by the atomic bomb and still urgently relevant in every subsequent generation, was not answered by the war. It was definitively posed by it. Fact 88. The war in numbers, the scale of destruction. The specific scale of the Second World War's destruction, measured in human lives, in physical infrastructure, in cultural heritage, in economic output, and in the specific categories of loss that resist quantification but are no less real for that resistance, constitutes a confrontation with human destructive capacity so extreme that the numbers, even when assembled with care, function as abstractions that protect us from the specific human reality they represent, and whose honest engagement requires the specific effort to resist the abstraction and recover the individual human weight behind each unit of the statistical summary. Between 70 and 85 million people died in the Second World War, the range of uncertainty itself a testament to the scale of the killing, since deaths in the tens of millions are difficult to count with precision. Approximately 55 million of those deaths occurred among civilians, making the Second World War the first conflict in modern history in which civilian deaths substantially exceeded military deaths, a statistical expression of the specific character of the war's conduct, in which the deliberate targeting of civilian populations through aerial bombardment, deliberate starvation, genocide, and reprisal killing was a feature of virtually every theater of operations. Approximately 1,700 cities and towns were destroyed or severely damaged across Europe and Asia. Approximately 70,000 villages in the Soviet Union were destroyed. Approximately 6 million buildings were demolished in Germany alone. The economic output of Europe in 1945 was approximately half of its 1938 level. The specific irreplaceable losses, the manuscripts burned in libraries, the artworks looted or destroyed, the scientific careers ended, the books never written, the music never composed, the children never born to the millions who died before they could have them, cannot be quantified at all, but they are part of the war's cost, and their specific weight is as real as the weight of the buildings that were destroyed. Fact 89. The war's animals, the non-human cost. The animals of the Second World War, the horses, mules, dogs, pigeons, camels, and elephants that served with the armies of the major belligerent powers in roles ranging from combat to communication to supply, and whose specific vulnerability to the conditions of industrial warfare was as total as the vulnerability of the human soldiers beside whom they worked, while their specific capacity for understanding their situation was considerably less. Occupied in the war's history, a position of simultaneous operational importance and near-complete invisibility in the official and popular record, beings whose contributions were essential and whose suffering was real, and who received the attention their service deserved from the individual soldiers, who worked alongside them far more consistently than from the military and political institutions that deployed them. The British Army used approximately 750,000 horses and mules during the war, primarily in the North African, Italian, and Burmese theatres, where terrain and supply limitations made mechanized transport impractical. The specific conditions of the Burmese jungle campaign, where mules were essential for supplying forces operating in roadless mountain terrain, produced an intimate dependence between the soldiers and the animals that supplied them, whose specific emotional character is captured in the memoir literature of the campaign with a consistency that reflects genuine attachment rather than sentiment. The Soviet Army used dogs in roles including mine detection, message carrying, and the carrying of anti-tank explosives in a suicide attack program that killed thousands of animals in a tactic whose specific effectiveness was limited and whose specific ethics were not a primary Soviet military concern. Carrier pigeons, whose specific navigational ability remained useful when radio communications were disrupted or unavailable, served in all theaters of the war and in several documented cases delivered messages in conditions that would have prevented any other communication method from functioning. 32 animals were awarded the Dickin Medal, the British equivalent of the Victoria Cross for animal recipients, during the war, a recognition that acknowledged the specific reality that the war was not fought by human beings alone. Fact 90. The Second World War at 90. 10 facts from the end. 90 facts into the story of the Second World War, 10 facts from the end, and the war's full presence in every dimension of the world we inhabit is impossible to miss. The institutions it produced still govern international relations. The borders it drew still define the political map of Europe and the Middle East. The technologies it accelerated still shape the material conditions of daily life. The legal principles it established still provide the framework within which international accountability for atrocity is attempted. And the specific human experiences it produced, the specific courage of the resistors and the specific suffering of the victims, the specific moral choices made by the bystanders, and the specific crimes committed by the perpetrators, are still being recovered from archives, from survivor testimony, and from the patient work of historians who understand that the specific human weight behind the war's vast statistics is the most important thing about it, and the thing most at risk of being lost as the last survivors of the generation that lived it die, and the war passes fully from living memory into history. 10 facts remain. They will complete the story of the most destructive conflict in human history, not by resolving the moral questions it raises, which do not resolve, but by honoring the full weight of what happened, the full complexity of what it meant, and the full obligation that what was done and what was survived places on those of us who inherited the world it made. The darkness was absolute. The world that came after it was not. That is the most important fact of all. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 91. The war's children who became leaders, the greatest generation. The generation that fought the Second World War, the Americans, British, Soviets, and citizens of every other belligerent nation who were born between approximately 1910 and 1927, and who spent their formative young adult years in uniform or in the factories and fields of the home front, produced in the decades that followed the war a cohort of political, scientific, cultural, and business leaders whose specific formative experience of shared sacrifice, collective purpose, and the specific moral clarity of a just struggle against an unambiguous evil shaped their approach to every subsequent challenge in ways that distinguished their specific political generation from those that preceded and followed it. The specific claim that this generation was the greatest, a designation popularized by the journalist Tom Brokaw in his 1998 book of the same name, is a romanticization whose specific limitations should be acknowledged. The generation that defeated fascism also sustained racial segregation in America, colonialism in Asia and Africa, and the specific social conformities of the 1950s that their children's generation would eventually rebel against. But the specific qualities that the war developed in the people who served, the capacity for sustained collective effort in service of a goal larger than individual interest, the specific tolerance for hardship and uncertainty that the war's conditions had imposed, and the specific commitment to building institutions capable of preventing a repetition of the catastrophe they had survived, did produce in the post-war decades a generation of leaders whose specific institutional creativity was remarkable. The United Nations, NATO, the Marshall Plan, the European Coal and Steel Community, the GI Bill, the National Health Service, all were conceived and implemented by people whose specific understanding of what happens when international institutions fail was not theoretical but experiential. They had seen the League of Nations fail. They had seen appeasement fail. They had lived through the consequences of those failures in the most direct and most personal possible terms, and they built better institutions because they understood with absolute clarity what the cost of building inadequately would be. Fact 92. The war's literature, writing the unwritable asterisk. The body of literature produced by and about the Second World War, the novels, memoirs, poems, and plays that emerged from the conflict and from the decades of reflection that followed it, is vast, various, and in its best instances as morally serious and as formally ambitious as any body of writing produced in response to any single event in human history. It is also, in its specific relationship to the First World War's literary legacy, a body of writing whose character is strikingly different, less elegiac, less lyrical, and in many cases more direct in its confrontation with the specific physical and moral horror of what it describes, because the writers who experienced the Second World War had been formed by the First World War's literary legacy and were writing in conscious awareness of it. Joseph Heller's Catch-22, published in 1961, based on Heller's experience as a bombardier in the Mediterranean theater, used the specific satirical method of the absurd to capture something essential about the specific irrationality of military bureaucracy that neither conventional realism nor the elegiac mode could have achieved. Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, published in 1948, brought the specific physical experience of Pacific Island combat into the American literary mainstream with a directness that was unprecedented. Paul Celan's Death Fugue, written in Romanian by a Romanian Jewish survivor of forced labor camps, in the German language of the perpetrators, as an act of linguistic reckoning, whose specific formal achievement compressed the Holocaust's horror into a poem of unbearable beauty, established a standard of moral seriousness in response to the Holocaust that subsequent writers have measured themselves against. Primo Levi's If This Is a Man, the memoir of an Italian Jewish chemist's survival at Auschwitz, written immediately after the war in prose of extraordinary clarity and moral precision, remains the most important single literary account of the Holocaust's interior experience. A work whose specific combination of scientific detachment and profound human empathy produces in its readers a confrontation with the specific reality of the camp system that no other form of writing has equaled. Fact 93. The war's music, voices from the darkness asterisk. The musical culture of the Second World War, the compositions, the songs, the jazz recordings, the symphonies, and the popular music that the war inspired, sustained, and in some cases destroyed, constitutes one of the most revealing cultural archives of the conflict, a record of the specific emotional conditions of the war years whose different registers, the sentimental popular songs of the home front, the defiant broadcasts of the BBC, the music composed in the ghettos and the camps, the jazz that the Nazis banned as degenerate and that Allied soldiers carried across the world, expressed dimensions of the war's human experience that the political and military record does not capture. The BBC's wartime broadcasts, which reached occupied Europe through illegal listening that the German occupation authorities punished severely but could not eliminate, used music as a specific medium of solidarity and resistance. The Morse code signature of V for victory tapped out before broadcasts, identical to the opening notes of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, connected the specific cultural heritage of European classical music to the specific political meaning of resistance in a way that propaganda in any other form could not have achieved. Olivier Messiaen, captured by German forces in June 1940 and held as a prisoner of war, composed his quartet for the end of time in the Stalag VIIA prisoner of war camp in Görlitz, performing its premiere in January 1941 before an audience of approximately 400 fellow prisoners on a broken cello, a slightly damaged clarinet, an unheated upright piano, and a violin in January temperatures that froze the performer's fingers. The music composed in the Warsaw Ghetto and in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, by composers who were subsequently murdered in the death camps, includes works of genuine beauty and specific historical importance, whose recovery by musicologists, since the war has provided a partial but irreplaceable record of the cultural life that the Holocaust destroyed. The specific act of making music in conditions designed to extinguish humanity was itself a form of resistance, a declaration that the human spirit could not be entirely reduced to the degraded state that the camp system was designed to produce. Fact 94, the war's moral legacy, what we learned and what we didn't asterisk. The specific moral lessons that the Second World War taught, and the specific degree to which those lessons were, or were not absorbed by the civilization that survived the war and built the world that followed it, is the question whose answer determines everything about how the war should be remembered and what remembering it obligates us to do. The lessons that were absorbed, at least institutionally, are visible in the architecture of the post-war order. The United Nations, the Nuremberg Principles, the Genocide Convention, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Project of Integration, the Marshall Plan's demonstration that the victor's generosity toward the defeated serves the long-term interest of peace better than punitive settlement. These were genuine achievements of moral and institutional learning, built by people who understood with experiential specificity what the cost of failing to learn was. The lessons that were not absorbed, or that were absorbed incompletely, selectively, or temporarily, are visible in the subsequent history of the post-war world. The Holocaust's specific lesson that genocidal ideology must be resisted from its earliest expressions rather than accommodated until it becomes militarily irresistible was not consistently applied in Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, or Darfur. The specific lesson that the colonial exploitation of Asian and African populations by European powers was morally incompatible with the democratic values the war was fought to defend was applied to European decolonization with a speed that created new forms of instability, even as it eliminated an old injustice. The specific lesson that nuclear weapons represented a qualitative change in the nature of war that required qualitative change in international relations was absorbed into the Cold War's balance of terror doctrine rather than into the prohibition and elimination that many of the Manhattan Project's scientists had advocated. The war taught everything that needed to be learned to prevent the next catastrophe. The specific question of whether we are learning it, whether each generation that inherits the war's legacy is learning it anew with sufficient seriousness, is not a historical question. It is a present one. Fact 95, the war's survivors living with memory. The survivors of the Second World War, the concentration camp survivors, the bombing survivors, the veterans of every theater from the Eastern Front to the Pacific, the resistance fighters, the prisoners of war, the civilian populations of every occupied country, the Jewish communities of Europe who emerged from hiding or from the forests or from the camps to find their world destroyed, carried the war's specific weight with them for the rest of their lives, in ways that the societies they returned to were systematically unprepared to acknowledge or support, and whose specific psychological character, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, was classified in the medical vocabulary of 1945 as personal weakness, adjustment difficulty, or simple unwillingness to get on with life. The Holocaust survivors who came to Israel, to the United States, to Britain, and to other countries of refuge in the years after the war encountered a specific social pressure to be silent, to set aside what had happened, to become normal citizens of their new countries, rather than bearers of an experience that the societies receiving them found too disturbing to absorb in the immediate aftermath of a war that had already exhausted their emotional capacity. Many complied. Many spent decades not speaking to their children about what had happened to them, and their children grew up in households shaped by an absence they could feel but not name. The specific silence of the survivor generation, and the specific explosion of testimony that followed when the generation recognized that it was approaching the end of its life, and that the obligation to witness required speaking before it was too late, produced in the 1980s and 1990s a surge of survivor testimony whose collection and preservation became one of the most urgent cultural projects of the late 20th century. Steven Spielberg's Shoah Foundation, established after the filming of Schindler's List in 1993, collected approximately 55,000 testimonies from Holocaust survivors and witnesses in 32 languages. Each testimony is a specific life. Each life is the specific refutation of the specific attempt to exterminate it. Fact 96, the war's continuing presence, why it still matters. The Second World War is not past. It is present in every dimension of the world we inhabit, in the borders that define the political map of Europe and Asia, in the institutions that govern international relations, in the technologies that shape material daily life, in the legal principles that attempt to hold states accountable for crimes against their own populations, in the specific political reflexes that the war's specific lessons have embedded in the political cultures of its survivors and their descendants. The European Union, the most ambitious political project in modern history, the voluntary pooling of sovereignty by nations that had spent centuries going to war with each other, is a direct and conscious response to the specific experience of 2 world wars in 30 years, an institutional expression of the specific determination that the conditions that had produced those wars must be structurally prevented from recurring. NATO, the military alliance that has maintained the security of its member states for more than 70 years, is a direct product of the specific lesson that collective security requires formal institutional commitment rather than the informal understanding that had proved insufficient in the 1930s. The nuclear non-proliferation regime, imperfect, contested, and in some respects failing, is a direct response to the specific danger that the Manhattan Project demonstrated when it showed that atomic weapons could be built by a determined national government with sufficient scientific and industrial capacity. The International Criminal Court, established by the Rome Statute of 1998, a full 50 years after the Nuremberg trials, established the principle that individual leaders could be held criminally accountable for crimes against humanity, is the specific institutional development of the Nuremberg legacy. Imperfect and contested, but representing the specific determination of the international community to make the principle of individual accountability for atrocity something more than a precedent applied only to the defeated. The war is present in each of these institutions, in the specific reasons they were built, in the specific failures they were designed to prevent, and in the specific urgency that the awareness of those failures gave to the people who built them. Fact 97, the war's memorials, stone and memory. The memorial culture produced by the Second World War, the monuments, museums, commemorative sites, and annual ceremonies through which the war's dead are honored, and its lessons are transmitted to generations with no personal memory of the events being commemorated, is the largest and most geographically distributed body of public commemoration in human history, reflecting the war's global reach and its specific claim on the moral consciousness of every civilization it touched. The Holocaust memorial culture has developed with particular intensity and particular institutional investment in the decades since the war, driven by the specific moral imperative of a crime whose perpetrators had intended not only to kill their victims, but to erase the evidence of their existence. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, established in Jerusalem in 1953, maintains the world's largest archive of Holocaust documentation and has so far recovered and preserved the names of approximately 4.8 million of the approximately 6 million Jewish victims, each name representing the specific act of recovery that the Nazi system's attempt at complete erasure makes both necessary and perpetually incomplete. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, opened in 1993 adjacent to the National Mall, where the monuments to American democracy stand, places the Holocaust in deliberate proximity to the symbols of the nation whose military power helped end it, and whose political values it most directly challenges and most urgently vindicates. The specific design of Daniel Libeskind's Jewish Museum in Berlin, a building whose floor plan traces the shape of a distorted Star of David, whose internal spaces deliberately disorient and unsettle the visitor, and whose garden of exile forces the visitor to walk on uneven ground that produces the physical sensation of instability and disorientation. Attempts to translate the specific experience of exile and loss into architectural form in ways that conventional memorial design cannot achieve. The war's memorials are not for the dead. The dead are beyond memorials. They are for the living, and for the specific work of remaining human in the face of knowledge of what human beings have done to each other. Fact 98. The war's children, the generation that rebuilt. The children of the Second World War, those born in the late 1930s and early 1940s, who were too young to fight but old enough to experience the war's specific disruptions of childhood. The evacuation, the bombing, the absent fathers, the rationed food, the specific quality of a world in which adult certainty had been replaced by adult fear, became in the 1950s and 1960s the generation that rebuilt the war-damaged world, and in the 1960s and 1970s, the generation that challenged the values and the social structures of the societies that the war had produced. The specific paradox of the post-war baby boom, the enormous increase in birth rates that followed the veterans' return, producing the largest generational cohort in the history of the Western democracies, was that the generation produced in the optimism and prosperity of the post-war years was formed in the shadow of a catastrophe it had not experienced directly, but whose specific weight was present in every household, through the silences of parents who had survived it, and the specific cultural preoccupations of a society that was simultaneously celebrating its survival and repressing its memory of what survival had cost. The specific rebellion of the 1960s generation against the conformity, the Cold War nuclear anxiety, the racial segregation, and the specific foreign policy decisions of the post-war order was shaped by the war in the specific sense that it was shaped by the gap between the values the war had been fought for and the specific ways in which the societies that had won it were failing to embody those values consistently. The civil rights movement challenged the specific contradiction between a nation that had fought for freedom and democracy and its systematic denial of those qualities to its black citizens. The anti-Vietnam War movement challenged the specific application of Cold War military power in terms derived from the moral framework that the Second World War had established. The war that the greatest generation fought produced the generation that challenged their inheritance, and the challenge was made possible by the specific moral vocabulary that the war had bequeathed. Fact 99. The war's final accounting, what was gained, what was lost. The final accounting of the Second World War, the specific attempt to weigh what the conflict cost against what it achieved, to assess the specific relationship between the price paid and the outcome received, in a calculation whose specific moral difficulty is compounded by the impossibility of knowing what the alternative to the war's specific outcome would have produced, is the accounting that every generation that inherits the war's legacy is obligated to attempt. Even knowing that no final balance can be struck, and that the attempt itself is a moral exercise as much as a historical one. What was lost is beyond full enumeration. Between 70 and 85 million human lives, each of them a world of experience, relationship, and possibility that ended before it was completed. 6 million Jews murdered in the most systematic genocide in human history, representing approximately 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe and 1/3 of the Jewish people of the entire world. The cultural inheritance of centuries of European Jewish civilization, the Yiddish language as a primary vernacular, the specific intellectual and religious traditions of the shtetl communities of Eastern Europe, effectively destroyed in a decade of industrialized murder. The physical inheritance of thousands of years of European civilization, the libraries, the artworks, the buildings, the cities, reduced to rubble across a continent. The specific human potential of the generations whose lives were truncated by the war, the music not composed, the science not discovered, the children not born, the relationships not sustained. What was gained is also real. The defeat of a specific form of totalitarian racism that intended to remake the world in its own image. The establishment of institutional frameworks whose specific purpose was to prevent the recurrence of the conditions that had produced the war. The specific acceleration of decolonization that extended to billions of people in Asia and Africa, rights that their colonizers had denied them. The specific technological inheritance that has saved more lives through medicine than the war destroyed through violence. The accounting does not balance. The price was too high. But the alternative, the world that would have existed had the war not been fought, or had it been lost, was more terrible still. Fact 100. The Second World War, a story that continues *. 100 facts into the story of the Second World War, and the story, as all true stories about the most consequential events in human history, does not end. The war ended. On September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the formal instruments of Japanese surrender were signed, and the most destructive conflict in the history of human civilization was officially concluded. The guns were silent. The bombers returned to their bases. The prisoners were released, those who survived to be released. The dead remained dead. The world that emerged from the war was permanently and irrevocably changed in every dimension, politically, economically, technologically, legally, morally. But the story of what the war was and what it means did not end with the surrender ceremony. It continues in the testimony of the survivors, in the work of the historians and the journalists and the novelists and the filmmakers who have spent 8 decades trying to understand and transmit what happened. It continues in the institutions that were built to prevent its recurrence, and in the specific tests those institutions face every generation. It continues in the moral questions, the war raised that no subsequent generation has fully answered, about the justification of violence, about the limits of military necessity, about the obligation of bystanders, about the specific conditions under which ordinary human beings become capable of extraordinary evil. And it continues in the specific present tense of the world we inhabit, in the borders the war drew, in the institutions it built, in the technologies it created, in the moral vocabulary it established, in the specific political reflexes it embedded in the cultures of its survivors and their descendants. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, the war is over. The world it made is the world you live in. The people who survived it built what they could from what remained. They built imperfectly, as human beings always do, but they built, and in the specific shadow of the most destructive event in human history, building anything was an act of hope whose specific character we are still trying to honor and still trying to be worthy of. This has been explored during sleeping.